welcome. Whether you're tucked in on a rainy evening in Portland, winding down after a long day in Nashville, or just looking for a quiet place to rest your mind, you've found it. This is the Enchanted Library, and tonight it belongs to you. Over the next few hours, we'll wander through 100 extraordinary facts about ancient books, drifting dust motes, candlelit reading nooks, and the remarkable human story behind every page ever turned, woven not as a list, but as a single, unhurried night spent among the shelves. There's nothing you need to do here. No notes to take, no pace to keep. Just settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the library do what libraries have always done best: make the world outside feel a little further away, and the world inside these pages feel a little more like home. The candle is lit. The dust is drifting. Let's begin. Underscore 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 underscore. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only inside old libraries. Not the silence of emptiness, of rooms waiting to be filled, but something far richer and stranger than that: the silence of 10,000 voices, all holding their breath at once. Pause for a moment, if you will. Imagine you are standing at the entrance of one of those grand, forgotten reading rooms, the kind with arched ceilings and windows made of rippled glass that bends the daylight into something softer, something amber. The air is cool against your skin. It carries a scent that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never stood exactly where you are standing now. It is the smell of time made tangible, of stories pressed between covers like flowers between the pages of a diary. That scent, that unmistakable perfume of old paper and quiet wood, even has a name. Scholars and conservators call it bibliosmia, and it is no accident or trick of the imagination. The aroma that rises from the pages of an old book is caused by the gradual chemical breakdown of the organic compounds within the paper itself. As paper ages, it releases hundreds of volatile organic compounds, including vanillin, which is the same molecule responsible for the warm, sweet scent of vanilla. This is why ancient books so often smell faintly of something edible. Something that makes you want to lean closer, to breathe deeper, as though the book itself were offering you something nourishing. Which, in a way, it always is. Step forward now. Let your fingers trail along the spines of the shelves nearest to you. They are cool and slightly rough beneath your touch, some cloth-bound, some leather, some so old the titles have worn away entirely, leaving only the ghost of gold lettering pressed into the grain. The shelves themselves are old oak, darkened by decades of proximity to candlelight and the oils from countless passing hands. And all around you, drifting on the barely perceptible movement of air, are the dust motes. Watch them for a moment. They seem to hang without purpose, without direction, spinning in the light as though time here moves at a different pace than it does outside these walls. But they are not still. They are never truly still. The movement of dust motes in a sunbeam is governed by a phenomenon called Brownian motion, the ceaseless, random bombardment of tiny particles by individual air molecules too small to see. What looks like dreamy, Purposeless drifting is in fact a record of invisible collisions happening millions of times each second, a microscopic storm that only reveals its existence in the slow waltz of particles through light. Every mote you see dancing in that golden column is being pushed by a force you will never be able to observe directly. There is something humbling in that thought, isn't there? The world is full of invisible forces shaping visible things. Find yourself a chair, there, by the window, the high-backed one upholstered in faded burgundy. Settle into it. Feel the familiar sigh of old cushions receiving your weight. Before you on the reading table sits a book, left open by some previous visitor who must have stepped away long ago and never returned. The pages are yellowed at their edges, curling very slightly toward the spine, the way pages do when a book has lived in a room that has known both fire and frost. Lean forward and look at the paper itself, not the words, not yet, but the material the words are written upon. What you are looking at is one of the oldest technologies human hands have ever refined. Paper as we know it was invented in China around 105 CE by a Han Dynasty court official named Kailuan, who developed a process of pulping bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets into a smooth, workable sheet. Before this, civilizations had written on everything from clay tablets and papyrus to wax and silk. Kailuan's invention, often considered one of the most consequential in all of human history, allowed knowledge to become portable, reproducible, and abundant in a way it had never been before. The page in front of you, ordinary as it seems, is the inheritor of more than 2,000 years of that tradition. Run your eyes to the edge of the page now. See how it has turned that particular shade of warm ivory, darker at the very corner where it has been touched again and again by reading hands over the years. That darkening tells a story of its own. The yellowing and browning of paper over time is primarily caused by oxidation and acid hydrolysis, processes in which the cellulose fibers that make up the paper slowly break down. Many historical papers were made with high acid content from the wood pulp used in their manufacture, which accelerated this decay. Conservators working to preserve ancient manuscripts today often treat documents with alkaline solutions to neutralize this acidity and slow the aging process, essentially buying the paper more time, more years in which to be read, more years in which to hold its words safely against the advancing dark. Outside the library window, a cloud passes before the sun. The shaft of light dims, and the dust motes vanish, as though they were never there. The room deepens. The shadows between the shelves thicken to something almost velvety. And then, slowly, generously, the cloud moves on, and the light returns. The motes reappear in the beam, exactly where they were, as patient and constant as ever. You reach out and very carefully turn the page. That sound. That soft, whispering turn of a page, dry and feather-light, the briefest flutter of disturbed air. It is one of the most quietly satisfying sounds in all of human experience, and it is not as simple as it appears. The acoustic quality of a page turn, that characteristic soft rustle, is determined by the weight, grain direction, and surface texture of the paper. The fibers in a sheet of paper are laid during manufacturing in a predominant direction called the grain, and a page turned against the grain will behave and sound subtly different from one turned with it. Bookbinders and fine printers have always been attentive to grain direction, because a book bound against the grain will eventually warp and buckle, its pages resisting the natural tendency of the paper to lie flat. A well-made book, turned in hand, has a particular rightness to how its pages fall, a suppleness earned by craft and careful material choice. The page settles. You smooth it gently with your palm and look up again at the room around you. These library nooks, these intimate, enclosed spaces carved between shelves and beside windows, have a long and deliberate history. In medieval European monasteries, individual alcoves called carrels were built into the stone walls of scriptoria, the rooms where monks copied manuscripts by hand. Each carrel was designed to seat one scribe, positioned near a window to make use of natural light while shielding the worker from drafts that might disturb the ink or chill the hands. The carrel created a private world within a communal space, a personal boundary that allowed focus and contemplation without isolation. Modern library study carrels descend directly from this monastic design, carrying within their plain wooden partitions more than 1,000 years of intentional quiet. Look around you at this nook, your nook. The shelves form its walls on two sides, the window fills one end with gray gold light, and behind you the rest of the library opens out in hushed, cathedral space. You are enclosed, but not trapped. Held, but not confined. This is by design. And the books that surround you, what are they, exactly? What makes a tome ancient, in the truest sense of the word? The oldest known bound book in the world is the Attilatero, though the title of oldest surviving complete bound manuscript is generally awarded to the Nag Hammadi Codices, a collection of Coptic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, dating to approximately the 4th century CE. But even these are relative newcomers. The oldest known written documents, Sumerian clay tablets from Mesopotamia, date to around 3400 BC, predating the concept of the book entirely. They record not poetry or prayer, but grain transactions, livestock inventories, administrative accounts. The earliest impulse to write things down was not, it seems, a spiritual or artistic one. It was a deeply human need to remember who owed what to whom. The light through the window has grown warmer. Afternoon is deepening toward early evening. The dust motes in the beam have multiplied, or perhaps only become more visible, more of them catching the richer, lower angle of the late sun. In this golden hour, the library feels most itself. And the dust itself, that fine, silvery gold substance through which the light moves so beautifully, is stranger than it looks. Library dust is not a single substance but a complex mixture, dead skin cells shed by every person who has ever walked through the room, fibers from clothing and book cloth and decaying paper, pollen carried in from outside, mineral particles, and fungal spores. In old libraries, a significant portion of the dust can actually be composed of fragments of the books themselves, microscopic shreds of paper, leather, and binding cloth contributed by each volume as it ages. The dust in a library is, in a very literal sense, made partly of stories, of the physical remains of the objects that contain them. Perhaps that is why it catches the light the way it does, as though it remembers. You turn another page, and another. The room around you does not hurry you. It never does. One of the most remarkable and underappreciated qualities of a great library is not its collection but its atmosphere, the way it makes the passage of time feel different inside its walls. Researchers studying reading environments have found that enclosed, acoustically dampened spaces with low ambient light, precisely the conditions of a traditional library reading nook, encourage a state of focused attention sometimes described as deep reading, in which the brain processes text more slowly, more thoroughly, and with greater retention than it does in bright, open, or digitally stimulated environments. The architecture of the library nook is, in this sense, a technology for thought, as purposefully designed to achieve an effect on the mind as any machine. The candle on the table beside you, for there is a candle, there is always a candle in a room like this, flickers once, steadies, and burns on. Its warm circle of light holds the shadows just far enough back. And in the shelves around you, the books wait. They are very good at waiting. They have always been better at waiting than people are. The oldest ones, the ones with the thickest spines and the most worn covers, carry within them something that science has only recently begun to understand. Researchers in the emerging field of bibliomics, the material analysis of historic books, have discovered that ancient manuscripts often contain extraordinary biological information locked within their physical substance. DNA extracted from the animal skin parchment of medieval books has been used to reconstruct the livestock populations of entire regions, to trace the movements of historical trade routes, and even to identify the specific flocks of sheep from which individual manuscripts were made. A single medieval Bible, examined carefully enough, can tell a story about the landscape and agriculture of its era that no written text ever recorded. The books have been keeping secrets all along, not in their words, but in their very flesh. You sit back in your chair. The library breathes around you, slowly, deeply, the way old buildings breathe when the people inside them have finally grown still enough to match the pace of the stones. The dust motes drift. The page lies flat beneath your palm. There are 90 facts still to come. 9 more rooms to pass through, 9 more shafts of light to follow. But for now, just this. Just the hush, and the golden air, and the weight of all these patient, waiting words. The evening has shifted almost imperceptibly since we last sat here. The candle has burned a little lower. The shadows have moved a few degrees around the room, the way shadows always do in candlelight, not in jumps or sudden changes, but in a long, slow turning, as patient as the hour hand of a clock. If you have been paying close attention, you might have noticed the books around you look different in this light. The gold lettering on their spines catches the flame in a way it did not catch the afternoon sun. They seem, in this moment, to lean almost imperceptibly toward you. This is the hour when the library feels most inhabited. Not by the living, not by the footsteps and whispered conversations of the day, but by everything that was poured into these books before they ever arrived on these shelves. By the hands that made them. Because every book you see in a room like this one did not simply appear. It was made. Each one is the record of a human life spent in concentration, sometimes years, sometimes an entire lifetime, bent over a surface with instruments you would barely recognize, working in the service of a text. And among the oldest books in this room, the work of making them was so demanding, so painstaking, so physically consuming, that it has left traces we can still detect today. Medieval scribes who spent their careers copying manuscripts by hand often developed distinctive physical deformities from the work. The repetitive motion of writing with a quill, gripping the shaft tightly, pressing consistently into the surface of the parchment, could cause chronic pain in the fingers, wrist, and shoulder. Skeletal remains of monks identified as scribes from their burial sites have shown asymmetrical bone development, with the dominant writing arm showing signs of significantly heavier use. Some scribes even recorded their own suffering in the margins of the texts they were copying, brief, remarkably human complaints in Latin, noting that their fingers ached, that the light was failing, that the cold had made the ink thicken. These marginal notes, called colophons, are among the most intimate and unexpectedly moving things that survive from the medieval world. A monk's passing grumble about cold fingers, preserved across 800 years. Run your eyes along the shelf to your left. There, the book with the deep burgundy cover and the tarnished brass clasp. You can see, even from where you sit, that the leather is cracked along the spine in a particular way, splitting in fine lines like the surface of dry earth. That cracking is age, yes, but it is also a story of the material itself, of where the book came from before it was a book at all. The covers and pages of many medieval manuscripts were made from vellum, a material prepared from the stretched and scraped skin of calves, sheep, or goats, rather than from plant-based paper. The preparation of vellum was an exacting and lengthy process. The skin had to be soaked in a lime solution to loosen the hair, then stretched on a frame under tension, while still wet, and scraped repeatedly with a curved blade called a lunellum to achieve an even, translucent surface. A single large manuscript Bible might require the skins of 200 or more animals to produce enough pages. The quality of the finished vellum, its smoothness, its whiteness, its ability to hold ink without bleeding, depended entirely on the skill of the craftsperson preparing it, and the finest medieval vellum, prepared in centers of monastic learning, was prized across the whole of Europe. 200 animals for a single book. Hold that thought for a moment. Feel the weight of it. The library around you is not simply a collection of ideas. It is a collection of labors, of years and hands and living things, all given over to the project of holding something still long enough to be passed on. Settle back into your chair. The candle flame bends very slightly. There must be a draft somewhere, from under a door or through an old window frame that no longer fits quite perfectly in its stone setting. The flame steadies again. The light steadies with it. Look now at the open book on the table before you. Not at the words, but at the color of the ink itself, that dark, slightly brownish black that old manuscripts share, whatever language they are written in, whatever century they come from. That color tells you something important. The most widely used ink in European manuscripts from roughly the 5th through the 19th century was iron gall ink, made by combining oak galls, the small, round growths that appear on oak trees when certain wasps lay their eggs in the bark, with iron sulfate and a binding agent such as gum arabic. The chemical reaction between the tannins in the oak gall and the iron sulfate produced a dark, permanent ink that bonded chemically with the surface of the parchment or paper, making it extremely resistant to fading or washing away. It was, in many ways, an ideal writing ink, and it was used to write some of the most significant documents in history, including the Magna Carta, the original scores of Johann Sebastian Bach, and Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. Its one flaw, only fully understood in recent centuries, is that over long periods the iron compounds continue to react with the parchment or paper, slowly eating through it, a process called iron galling corrosion, leaving delicate, lace-like holes in the pages of some of the world's most precious manuscripts. Even the ink is complicated. Even the ink has consequences that outlast the intentions of the hand that laid it down. You reach out and brush the very edge of the page, the air just above it, not touching the surface itself. As you do, a small cloud of dust rises from the table, invisible until it enters the light, and then suddenly present, a small, private galaxy of particles drifting in the warm column above the candle. Watch them for a moment. Notice how they move quite differently here than they did in the afternoon sunbeam, faster, more turbulent, driven by the heat rising from the flame below. The physics of the room have changed with the hour. The movement of air above a candle flame follows a process called convective flow. The heated air directly above the flame is less dense than the cooler air surrounding it, and rises rapidly, drawing cooler air in from the sides to replace it. This continuous circulation creates a column of faster moving, warmer air above the flame, and any dust particles caught within it are swept upward and outward in patterns entirely different from the slow Brownian drift of dust in still air. In candlelit rooms, the only illuminated rooms in most of human history until the 19th century, all dust motes were in this state of constant, flame-driven circulation. The still, floating drift of dust motes that we associate with libraries today is, in a sense, a modern phenomenon. For most of history, the dust in reading rooms danced to the rhythm of fire. The thought of it, centuries of readers, centuries of hands and eyes and quietly turning pages, all working by the agitated, rising light of flame, sits in the room with you now like a presence. And speaking of pages turning, there is a particular ritual that very old libraries, and very old readers, observed when approaching a book of significant age. A ritual that is still taught to conservators and archivists today, and which changes, once you know it, how you will ever handle an old book again. Archivists and rare book conservators are trained never to use their fingertips to turn the pages of fragile manuscripts, instead using a smooth bone folder or cotton-gloved fingers positioned at the center of the page's lower edge, lifting rather than dragging. The reason is both chemical and mechanical. The natural oils and acids on human skin can transfer onto the surface of the paper or parchment, accelerating degradation along every line of contact. On a manuscript touched repeatedly over decades, the fingerprints of many readers can sometimes be detected, not just as smudges, but as long-term patterns of discoloration where the acid from human skin has, over time, left its permanent mark. When you look at the darkened, worn corners of the pages in very old books, you are seeing not just time, but the collected touch of everyone who held them. A kind of unintentional archive of presence. The candle has settled into its rhythm now, steady, quiet, the small sounds of the wick barely audible beneath the silence of the room. Somewhere in the deeper part of the library, a floorboard shifts and settles. Old buildings do this in the cooling of the evening, speaking very quietly to themselves, easing into the night. It is never alarming. It is, if anything, comforting. Evidence of mass and age and solidity. These walls have held this room intact through a very long time. And the books within them have been part of that continuity, not merely stored here, but in some sense active participants in the life of the building, in ways that are still being studied. Research in environmental conservation has found that large collections of books in enclosed spaces can meaningfully regulate the humidity of the air around them. Paper and parchment are hygroscopic. They absorb and release moisture from the surrounding atmosphere in response to changing humidity levels. A densely shelved library, with thousands of volumes all slowly exchanging moisture with the air, creates a naturally buffered microclimate that resists the rapid swings in humidity that can damage organic materials. Old libraries, in other words, help to preserve themselves. The books, collectively, protect each other, creating the stable conditions their own survival requires. This is now understood well enough that modern archivists designing new storage environments sometimes consult the natural buffering behavior of large paper collections when calculating climate control requirements. The books breathe the room into stability. The room returns the favor by holding them safe. You look around the shelves again, at the spines, the covers, the accumulated mass of it all, and you think about the chain of people involved in getting any one of these books to this particular shelf in this particular room. The scribe, the parchment maker, the binder, the scholar who annotated the margins in their small, urgent hand. The hands that carried it, traded it, inherited it, donated it. The librarian, there have always been librarians, who placed it here. The word library derives from the Latin librarium, itself from liber, meaning the inner bark of a tree, which in early Rome was used as a writing surface before paper became widely available. The connection is not merely etymological. The very material of early writing was living wood. The word we use for the building that houses writing still carries, at its root, the memory of the tree. Every library is, in its deepest linguistic sense, a forest that has been taught to hold still. That idea settles into the air of the room like something that was always already true, only just now said aloud. The evening deepens. The candle burns its slow, faithful burn. The dust motes continue their invisible negotiations with the air. And in the shelves around you, the books, those repositories of scribes' aching hands and oaken galls and stretched animal skins and 2,000 years of someone caring enough to write it down, wait with their characteristic, inexhaustible patience. The world's oldest continuously operating library is the Malatestiana Library in Cesena, Italy, founded in 1452 by Malatesta Novello, Lord of Cesena. Its original collection of over 100 hand-copied manuscripts remains intact, still chained to the desks for which they were made, a practice common in medieval libraries, where books were valuable enough to require securing against theft. The chains are still attached. The books have not moved from their desks in over 570 years. When you think about continuity of place and purpose, about something remaining exactly what it was meant to be for more than half a millennium, the Malatestiana is one of the most remarkable examples in all of human architecture. Chained books. It is an image that might at first seem imprisoning, even cruel. But consider it differently. Those chains are also a kind of dedication, a declaration that what is contained in these volumes is too important to lose, too precious to be carried away by any single pair of hands. The chain says, "This belongs to everyone who will ever sit here." You may read it, but it stays. The candle flickers once more. The flame recovers. Somewhere in the warm, layered dark of the upper shelves, a mote of dust turns and catches the light for just a moment, a single bright point, still and present, and then drifts on. The scent released when you open a very old book is not only caused by the breakdown of the paper itself, but also by the history of everything the book has absorbed over its lifetime. Old books can contain trace chemical signatures of the environments they have passed through, smoke from fireplaces, the oils of the hands that have read them, even residues from the foods and drinks of the rooms where they have lived. Conservators studying particularly ancient volumes have found evidence of specific environmental histories embedded in the chemistry of the paper. A book that lived in a smoky monastery smells different, at the molecular level, from one that spent the same centuries in a damp coastal library. Each old book carries, locked in its fibers, a chemical memoir of every room it has ever known. A memoir of rooms. You think about that. About how a book that has passed through 10 centuries of human hands has also passed through 10 centuries of human lives. Their fires, their foods, their fears, their mornings and evenings. All of it absorbed. All of it, in some infinitesimal way, still present. The practice of marginalia, notes, drawings, and comments written by readers in the margins of books, has existed for as long as books themselves. Medieval scholars annotated their manuscripts extensively, debating the text in real time with their own quills, leaving behind a kind of frozen conversation between the reader and the read. Some of the most illuminating historical insights into how people in previous centuries thought and argued come not from the official text of a manuscript, but from the private, unguarded observations scrawled in its margins. A reader in 12th century Paris, arguing in the margin with a Roman philosopher dead for 800 years. A monk in 14th century England drawing a small rabbit, inexplicably, beside a passage of dense theological Latin. The margins are where the reader becomes visible, where the pretense of the book as a one-way transmission breaks down, and something closer to a conversation begins. The library breathes around you. The night deepens beyond the rippled glass of the window. The candle draws its small, warm circle. 20 facts now. 20 small lights held up against the long dark of not knowing. There are 80 still to come. Rest here a little while longer. The books don't mind. There is a page in one of the books on the shelf to your right that, if you were to open it carefully and hold it at the right angle to the candlelight, would appear to glow. Not metaphorically. Not in the way we say things glow when we mean they are beautiful. Literally glow, catching the light and returning it to you as something warmer and brighter than what went in. That is gold leaf. And the fact that it is still there, still catching the light after 6 or 7 centuries, still holding its brilliance without tarnish or decay, tells you something profound about the nature of gold, and about the intentions of the person who laid it there. The technique of applying gold to manuscript pages, known as gilding or illumination, typically involved beating gold into sheets so thin they became nearly transparent, sometimes as thin as a single micron, roughly 1/100th the width of a human hair. Before laying the gold, the scribe would first apply a sticky, raised ground of gesso, a mixture of plaster, white lead, sugar, and fish or rabbit skin glue, which gave the gold its characteristic slight relief and made it catch light from multiple angles simultaneously. Pure gold does not tarnish or oxidize, which is why illuminated manuscripts made in the 12th century still glitter as brightly today as the day they were finished. The illuminator was not merely decorating the page. They were making a kind of permanent light, something that would outlast everything else in the room. Permanent light. Sit with that for a moment. The books that carry illumination were never ordinary books. They were objects of devotion, instruments of power, demonstrations of wealth and learning so expensive that their creation could consume the resources of an entire monastery for years. And yet within them, alongside the gold and the exquisite miniature paintings, something else was hidden, something that no one intended to preserve, but which has turned out to be among the most remarkable gifts the medieval world left behind. Scientists studying illuminated manuscripts have discovered that the vibrant blue pigment used in many medieval paintings and manuscripts, a color so intense and extraordinary that it had no natural rival in Europe, came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone found almost exclusively in a single valley in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. The stone had to be mined, crushed, and painstakingly refined to separate the pure blue mineral, lazurite, from the gray and white rock surrounding it. The resulting pigment, called ultramarine, was in medieval Europe more expensive than gold by weight. Its presence in a manuscript was a direct statement of extraordinary wealth and devotion, and today, when conservators detect lapis lazuli in a manuscript's pigments, they can use trace mineral analysis to identify with remarkable precision which specific deposit in Afghanistan the stone originated from, tracing the pigment back across 8 centuries of trade routes to the exact mountain from which it was dug. Afghanistan to a library shelf near you. The journey of a single shade of blue, across 800 years. Let your eyes drift up to the ceiling above the shelves. The old, smoke-darkened plasterwork, the beams that have settled into their permanent bowing over centuries. The room is very quiet now. The kind of quiet that feels inhabited rather than empty. That has texture and depth. You are aware, without quite being able to say why, that the silence here is not the absence of sound but the presence of something older than sound. Below your gaze, on the page before you, a single word has caught your attention. Not for its meaning. For the letter it begins with, an elaborate, looping capital that winds around a small painted figure, the two things intertwined in such a way that you can barely tell where the letter ends and the illustration begins. The decorative initial letters found in medieval manuscripts, called historiated initials when they contain a narrative scene, and inhabited initials when they contain figures not directly related to the text, were among the most technically demanding elements of manuscript illumination. A single complex initial could take a specialist artist several days to complete, and manuscripts were typically produced collaboratively. One craftsperson would copy the text, leaving blank spaces for the initials, which a separate illuminator would fill in afterward. The planning required to ensure the text and the decoration would fit together precisely, that the right amount of space would be left in exactly the right place, involved a level of coordinated craftsmanship across multiple specialists that is, in its way, more comparable to the production of a modern film than to what we casually think of as writing a book. A film produced over months or years, assembled by many hands, intended to move whoever encountered it. You turn the page, carefully, at its lower edge, just as the archivists do, and the sound of it is that same gentle whisper you have come to associate with this room. But this time, as the page settles, something happens that you did not expect. A single mote of dust, dislodged from the inner margin by the movement of air, rises through the candlelight and turns slowly upward. You watch it until it disappears into the dark above the flame. It occurs to you that this same thing has happened millions of times in this room. That every page ever turned here has sent something small and invisible upward into the air. That the room is, in some impossible to measure way, full of the accumulated disturbances of all those turnings, all those particles still slowly finding their rest. Dust in enclosed historic buildings is not randomly distributed but tends to accumulate in very specific patterns governed by airflow, gravity, and static electricity. Studies of dust distribution in old libraries and churches have found that certain surfaces, the tops of pages, the upper edges of book spines, horizontal ledges and cornices, accumulate dust at far higher rates than vertical surfaces. The upper edges of old books, in particular, act almost like filters, trapping airborne particles as they drift slowly downward through the air. The dust sitting on the top of an old volume is not merely dirt. It is a physical record of the air quality in that room across decades, and in some cases, conservators have been able to identify historical events such as nearby fires, building works, or changes in ventilation by analyzing the composition of dust layers on historic book collections. A record of the air across decades. Imagine how many stories are held not in the pages of these books but simply resting on top of them, in that fine gray-gold film of accumulated time. The candle beside you has reached its midpoint now. You can see the change in its character. The pool of wax at its base wider, the flame burning at a slightly different height than it did an hour ago. In the old world, a reader would have known the time not by any clock but by exactly this, by the height of the candle, the depth of the wax pool, the slow shortening of the light. Candles were not only illumination. They were, in a sense, the timepiece of the reading hour. Before the widespread adoption of mechanical clocks, candles were used across medieval Europe as a practical means of measuring time. Standardized candles of known composition and dimensions were manufactured specifically to burn at a predictable, consistent rate. A practice attributed in England to King Alfred the Great, who is said to have used candle clocks marked with evenly spaced rings to divide his day into structured periods of prayer, study, and governance. A monk reading by candlelight in a medieval scriptorium was not simply using the candle for a light. They were reading within the candle, their hours of study literally contained by and measured out by the flame. Reading within the flame. The idea has a quality of meditation to it, something that the bright, flat, unvarying light of a modern room does not offer. There is no sense of time passing in electric light. The candle made that passage visible, tangible, continuous. You knew where you were in the evening by watching what burned. The flame steadies. The room holds its breath. You reach for another book from the shelf, this one smaller, lighter, with a soft leather cover worn smooth by handling to the texture of old skin. When you open it, the spine gives with a faint, dry creak that is somehow one of the most satisfying sounds in the world. The sound a book's spine makes when opened is determined by the type of binding used in its construction. Books sewn with traditional Coptic binding, one of the oldest bookbinding techniques, originating in early Christian Egypt, can be opened completely flat without stress to the spine, and produce a soft, almost inaudible sound when the pages are turned. Books bound with tight back binding, in which the cover is glued directly to the spine of the sewn pages, produce the characteristic creak associated with old hardcovers, a sound caused by the adhesive between the spine and the cover flexing under stress. Bookbinders and conservators can often determine a book's approximate age and geographic origin simply by listening to how it opens. The sound is as diagnostic, in its way, as any visual inspection. You could spend a lifetime learning to listen to books. Some people have. The pages of this small volume are dense with small, precise handwriting, not printed type, but a hand so regular and controlled it almost resembles type at first glance. The ink is brown-black, the lines perfectly even, the margins left with a geometric precision that speaks of deep habit. Someone sat for a very long time over these pages. Someone believed that what they were writing down mattered enough to write it down this carefully. In medieval and early modern Europe, the preparation of a quill pen, the primary writing instrument of the era, was itself a skilled craft. Quills were taken from the flight feathers of large birds, most commonly geese, though swan quills were prized for their strength and raven quills for their fineness. The raw feather had to be hardened through a process of soaking in water followed by careful heating in hot sand, a technique called popping, which removed the natural oils and made the shaft rigid enough to be worked. The nib was then cut with a dedicated small knife, the penknife, which takes its name directly from this use, shaped to a precise point and slit to create the capillary channel that drew ink down to the writing surface. A skilled scribe could cut a new nib in under a minute. An unskilled one would ruin the feather entirely. The penknife remained in everyday use for so long, and became so associated with writing in general, that we still carry its name into an era of ballpoint pens and keyboards. The penknife, carried forward through 1,000 years of language, long after the quill that gave it meaning was gone. You set the small book down on the table beside the larger one. 2 books. 2 different centuries, 2 different hands, 2 entirely different journeys to this shelf. And yet here they are, beside each other in the candlelight, sharing the same warm dark, the same drifting dust, the same quality of patient silence. The organization of books and libraries has changed dramatically across history. The earliest libraries, such as the Great Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BC, stored clay tablets organized by subject, with cataloging systems sophisticated enough to include shelf marks and cross-references. Medieval monastic libraries often chained books to lecterns or shelves in the order they were most frequently used, with no systematic subject arrangement. The classification system most familiar to modern library users, the Dewey Decimal System, was only introduced in 1876 by American librarian Melville Dewey, who devised it as a 23-year-old library assistant. Before Dewey, the placement of a book on a shelf was often a matter of size, acquisition order, or the personal logic of whoever happened to be in charge of the shelves. The personal logic of whoever happened to be in charge. You look at the shelves around you with new affection. Their arrangement is not arbitrary. It is the expression of a mind, of whoever last decided what belonged next to what, which ideas should be neighbors, which conversation should be encouraged between spines. A library's shelving is a kind of argument, made in wood and paper, about how knowledge fits together, The candle burns on. 30 facts now, 30 points of light held up against the long history of these rooms and these pages. There is so much still to discover here. The night has barely begun. Someone was here before you. You can feel it in the particular way the chair has been pushed back from the table. Not abandoned, exactly, but set aside with intention, the way a person moves furniture when they mean to return. A pencil rests in the margin of an open notebook. A cardigan is folded over the arm of the reading chair beside the window. Whoever sits in that chair has sat there many times. The cushion holds the shape of them. This is what a library feels like when it is truly loved. Not curated. Not managed. Loved. Lived in, by someone who has given a portion of their life to knowing where everything is, and more than that, to understanding what everything means. Who knows that the third shelf from the floor on the left wall holds the cartography section, and that tucked behind the larger atlases there is a thin, unmarked volume of hand-drawn coastal maps that no catalog has ever properly recorded. Who knows these things not because they memorized them, but because they were here. Continuously, faithfully here. The role of the librarian is one of the oldest documented professions in human history. Among the cuneiform clay tablets discovered at the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh, part of the library of King Ashurbanipal, assembled around 650 BC, archaeologists found tablets bearing what are effectively shelf location marks and catalog entries, suggesting that dedicated staff were employed specifically to organize, retrieve, and protect the collection. These are among the earliest known records of a professional role defined entirely by the stewardship of written knowledge. The librarian, in other words, is not a modern invention. Wherever there have been books, there has been someone whose life's work was to take care of them. The cardigan on the chair. The pencil in the notebook. The quiet persistence of someone who chose this. You stand for a moment in the corridor between the shelves, looking both ways along its length. The shelves rise above your head and continue into shadow. There is a particular quality to this corridor, a narrowness, a closeness, that makes the books feel present in a way they do not when you are sitting in the open reading room. Here, the spines are close enough to touch on both sides simultaneously. The paper and leather of hundreds of volumes fills the air with that warm, complex, faintly sweet scent. You are inside the library now in a different sense than before. Surrounded rather than beside it. Research in environmental psychology has found that the physical experience of being enclosed between tall, densely packed bookshelves produces measurable changes in cognitive state. Participants in studies who read in narrow, book-lined alcoves demonstrated higher levels of sustained attention and lower self-reported stress than those reading in open-plan spaces, even when the lighting and noise levels were controlled to be identical. The effect is thought to be related to the concept of prospect and refuge, a theory in environmental psychology proposing that humans instinctively feel safer and more focused in spaces that offer enclosure and shelter while still maintaining a view of the surrounding environment. The library nook, with its shelved walls and its framed opening onto the wider room, satisfies both conditions simultaneously. It is a space that the human nervous system appears to find, on some deep and ancient level, simply right. Simply right? You feel it now standing here. The shelves on either side like arms. The long, low corridor drawing your eye gently forward. You walk slowly, trailing one hand along the spines at your left. The textures change under your fingertips: cloth, leather, paperboards, the occasional cold smooth of a later plastic jacketed spine among the older ones. Each has its own grain, its own temperature, its own degree of give. Some have lost their titles entirely. Some bear names and languages you do not read. One, very thick, bound in pale leather the color of old cream, has a title in Latin that you cannot quite make out in the dim light, and a date on the spine that stops your hand. 1563. Books produced before 1501 are classified by bibliographers and archivists as incunabula, from the Latin word for cradle, marking them as products of the infancy of European printing. The term captures a specific and remarkable half-century between Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type printing around 1440 and the turn of the 16th century, during which printing technology spread rapidly across Europe, and an estimated 28,000 distinct editions were produced, totaling somewhere between 8 and 20 million individual books. Before Gutenberg, perhaps 30,000 hand-copied manuscripts existed in the whole of Western Europe. Within 50 years of his press, that number had been exceeded many times over. The incunabulum on a library shelf is not simply an old book. It is an object from the moment everything changed, a physical artifact of one of the most consequential technological revolutions in human history. You do not pull the book from the shelf. You let your finger rest against its spine for a moment longer, then move on. Deeper into the corridor now. The shelves thicken around you. You notice, without having noticed it before, how quiet this part of the library is, a quality of quiet that goes beyond the mere absence of noise. It is a productive quiet, the kind that makes thought possible. And it is not accidental. The acoustic properties of a room lined with books are significantly different from those of an empty room of identical dimensions. The irregular surfaces of books, their varied heights, depths, and textures, scatter and absorb sound waves far more effectively than flat walls, dramatically reducing echo and reverberation. Sound engineers and acoustic designers have long known that bookshelves function as highly effective diffusers, and libraries lined with full shelves can achieve levels of acoustic dampening comparable to purpose-built recording studios or meditation spaces. The silence of an old library is, in part, engineered silence, produced and maintained by the physical mass of the books themselves, which absorb the sound of the room into themselves as thoroughly as they absorb everything else. The books hold the quiet as they hold everything else. As though silence were just another thing worth preserving. You have reached a junction in the corridor where two shelf rows meet at a corner, and someone, whoever left the cardigan on the chair, has placed a small wooden stool here, angled toward the meeting point of the shelves, with a lamp above it on a bracket. It is the most deliberate kind of reading spot, not a grand chair by a window, but a tucked, private, almost secret arrangement. A place within a place. A nook within the nook. You sit on the stool. The lamp overhead is warm. The shelves curve around three sides of you. It is, unexpectedly and immediately, one of the most comfortable places you have ever been. Studies examining reading comprehension and retention have found that readers who feel physically comfortable and sheltered in their reading environment consistently demonstrate better recall of material read than those in neutral or uncomfortable spaces, not because comfort reduces distraction, but because a sense of safety appears to lower the brain's ambient threat monitoring activity, freeing cognitive resources for deeper engagement with the text. In other words, the body's sense of being sheltered changes how well the mind reads. The perfect reading nook is not a luxury. It is, neurologically speaking, an instrument of better understanding. An instrument of better understanding. You look at the small stool, the bracket lamp, the 3 walls of shelves. Whoever arranged this corner knew something, even if they could not have named it. From somewhere in the library, from the larger reading room at the end of the corridor, perhaps, or from a room beyond it that you have not yet found, comes the faintest sound. Not a voice. Not footsteps. Just the soft, unmistakable sound of a page turning. Unhurried. Deliberate. Someone else is here, after all, reading in their own corner of the dark. In very large historic libraries, particularly those with multiple levels and long, echoing corridors, the sound of a page turning can travel remarkable distances through the building's structure. Stone and old wood transmit low-frequency vibrations efficiently, and the soft, dry rustle of heavy paper can be detected, in sufficiently quiet conditions, from 20 or 30 meters away. Readers in medieval monastic libraries, where absolute silence was required and enforced by rule, would have been acutely aware of the sounds of other readers at work around them. Each page turn a kind of punctuation in the shared silence, a small audible proof that the work of reading was happening, that knowledge was, in that moment, being received. A small audible proof. You sit with that. The distant page turn has already faded back into the quiet. But you heard it. And whoever turned that page may have heard yours. The lamp above you flickers very slightly, a brief, barely visible tremor in the light, gone before you can be certain it happened. The shadows between the shelves hold their position. Nothing changes. Everything stays exactly as it is, which is exactly as it has been, more or less, for a very long time. Many of the world's oldest functioning library buildings have remained structurally unchanged for centuries, not through dramatic preservation efforts, but through the simple physical protection that their books provide. Large collections of paper absorb humidity, moderate temperature fluctuations, and add significant mass to walls and floors that might otherwise be subject to settling or deterioration. The Bodleian Library in Oxford, parts of which date to the 14th century, and the Biblioteca Medicea Lorenziana in Florence, designed by Michelangelo in the 16th century, have both been found by structural engineers to owe part of their remarkable longevity to the stabilizing presence of their collections. The books hold the buildings up. The buildings hold the books in. It is, over centuries, a relationship of mutual support. Mutual support. The building and the books, sustaining each other across 500 years. The idea has the quality of something quietly heroic. 2 old things, each making the other possible. You lean back against the shelf behind you, gently, carefully, and look up along the corridor toward the faint, amber glow of the reading room at its end. From here it looks like the light at the end of a very long thought. Warm. Patient. Worth moving toward. But not quite yet. There is one more thing to notice from this stool, in this corner, before you go. Something you would only see from exactly here, at exactly this angle, in exactly this quality of light. On the shelf directly to your right, at eye level, a thin book has been shelved spiningward by mistake, or by design, or by the accumulated carelessness of decades, so that its pages face outward rather than its title. And what you can see, in the warm lamplight, is the exposed edge of its pages. Hundreds of them, compressed into a thickness of perhaps 2 centimeters, each one a slightly different shade of ivory and cream, their edges worn and soft. It is, in its way, one of the most beautiful things in the room. The visible edge of a book's pages, the surface exposed when a closed book is viewed from the top, bottom, or front, is called the foredge, and throughout history it has been used as a canvas in its own right. Craftspeople in 17th and 18th century England developed a technique called foredge painting, in which the pages of a book were fanned slightly, held under tension, and painted with a miniature scene along the angled surface. When the book was closed and the pages returned to their natural position, the painting became completely invisible, hidden within the compression of the pages. Only when the book was held and fanned at exactly the right angle would the image reappear, as vivid and complete as the moment it was made. Thousands of foredge painted books are believed to still exist in library collections around the world, their images unseen inside books that have never been fanned by anyone who knew to look. Hidden paintings. Inside closed books. Waiting in plain sight on shelves exactly like these ones. You look at the spines around you with new attention. How many of them, you wonder, are holding something you haven't thought to look for? The lamp overhead makes a sound so small you almost miss it, a faint tick of the metal bracket expanding very slightly in the warmth. Then silence again. You become aware, as you have become aware of things steadily throughout this evening, of just how many small, continuous processes are happening in this room at any given moment. The paper breathing. The wood settling. The dust drifting. The ink holding. The preservation of ink on paper is not a passive process, but an ongoing chemical negotiation between the ink, the paper, and the surrounding atmosphere. Modern conservation scientists have found that many historic inks are in a state of continuous, very slow reaction, iron gall ink still acidifying, some carbon-based inks slowly migrating through the fibers of the paper. Controlling temperature and humidity in a historic library is not merely about preventing mold or brittleness. It is about slowing dozens of simultaneous chemical reactions, each proceeding at its own rate, each nudged faster or slower by tiny changes in the environment. A single degree of temperature reduction in a library storage vault can, according to conservation models, extend the legible life of its documents by decades. Cold, dry darkness is, for a book, a kind of suspended animation, a slowing of time itself. A slowing of time. The library, held at the right temperature, is a machine for making the past last longer. You stand from the stool and stretch, quietly, slowly, the way one moves in rooms where sound feels like an intrusion. The corridor ahead leads back toward the reading room and its amber light. You begin to walk toward it, trailing your hand along the spines one last time. They are cool to the touch, even now. Paper has a measurable thermal mass. It absorbs and releases heat slowly, which is why the pages of a book stored in a cool room feel noticeably cold to the touch even in a warm-handed reader's hands. This property was observed and documented as early as the 18th century by naturalists studying the preservation of plant specimens in herbariums, who noted that pressed paper specimens stored in dense collections maintained stable temperatures far better than those stored loosely. In library conservation today, this thermal inertia is considered a meaningful factor in collection storage design. A tightly packed shelf of books, like a stone wall or a body of water, resists temperature change, warming slowly, cooling slowly, creating for the volumes within it a climate far more stable than the room around them would suggest. The books are cool in your hand, stable, unhurried. They have been holding their temperature patiently since long before you arrived, and they will hold it long after you have gone. The corridor opens out ahead of you into the reading room, wider, warmer, the candlelight joined here by the faint silver of moonlight through the tall window. You step through, and the room receives you. On the table by the window, the large book you were reading earlier still lies open, exactly where you left it. The pages have not moved. The dust motes above the candles still turn in their slow, faithful circles. Everything is, in the best possible sense, exactly as it was. Moonlight, unlike sunlight, contains virtually no ultraviolet radiation, the primary cause of photooxidative damage to paper and ink. This means that a book left open in a room lit only by moonlight experiences none of the fading and degradation that the same book would suffer in direct sunlight over an equivalent period. For centuries before the nature of UV radiation was understood, librarians and scholars nonetheless intuited that books kept from bright daylight lasted longer, developing the practice of shuttering library windows during the sunniest hours of the day. The north-facing reading room, a recurring feature of historic library design, was not an accident of architecture. It was an empirical solution to a problem whose mechanism would not be scientifically understood for another 300 years. The moonlight falls in a pale, clean rectangle across the floorboards. You watch it for a moment, how different it is from the candle's warmth, how it touches the edges of things without disturbing them. The smell of a library changes with the time of day. In the morning, cooler temperatures slow the release of volatile compounds from paper and binding materials, producing a subtler, quieter scent. As the room warms through the afternoon, heated by sunlight through the windows, by the presence of readers, by lamps and candles, the release of those compounds accelerates, and the characteristic richness of the bibliotic aroma intensifies. By evening, in a room that has been occupied and warmed all day, the scent of old books reaches something close to its fullest expression. The library you are sitting in now, at this hour, smells more completely of itself than it will at any other time. You are breathing it at its best. Breathe it in, then. Hold it for just a moment. 40 facts. 40 small lights. The room around you is full of more than you could count in a lifetime of evenings like this one. And the night, still, has a long way to go. The moonlight has moved. Only slightly. The rectangle it cast on the floorboards when you return to the reading room has shifted perhaps a hand's width toward the far wall, pulled by the slow turning of the earth and the time you spent in the corridor. You would not have noticed it if you hadn't been paying the particular kind of attention that this room encourages. The kind that makes small things visible. That is one of the gifts of a place like this. Not the books themselves, though the books are extraordinary. But what the books require of you in order to be read. A slowing. A settling. A willingness to let the world outside the window continue its business without you, just for a while. The library does not ask much. Only that you arrive, and sit, and pay attention. You sit. You pay attention. The average reading speed for an adult reading silently in their native language is approximately 200 to 250 words per minute. However, researchers studying reading in historic manuscript cultures have estimated that medieval scholars reading dense Latin or Greek texts, often reading aloud or in a low murmur as was common practice before silent reading became the norm, would have processed text at closer to 100 to 120 words per minute. Silent reading as a widespread, unremarkable habit is actually a relatively recent development in human history. For most of the ancient and medieval world, reading was understood to be a vocal act, something you heard as well as saw, and the shift to silent reading, which began gaining ground in Europe around the 10th and 11th centuries, was considered notable enough that contemporaries remarked upon it. When St. Augustine described his mentor Ambrose reading silently in the 4th century CE, he wrote about it with visible surprise as though he were witnessing something unusual and slightly mysterious. Reading in silence, in the way you are doing now, is a habit younger than you might think. Newer, in the long history of books, than almost anything else in this room. The candle beside you has burned low enough that you can see the base of the flame itself, that small, dark cone of unburned gas at its very center, surrounded by the blue and gold of combustion. You have been here long enough that the candle has become a kind of companion. Its changes mark your time. A book near the end of the nearest shelf has caught your attention for the last few minutes without you quite realizing why. It is not the largest book on the shelf, nor the oldest looking, nor the most ornate. It is simply the one your eye keeps returning to. Sometimes a book does that. Calls, without explaining itself. You reach out and take it down. The physical act of holding a book and turning its pages activates a significantly broader network of sensory and motor regions in the brain than reading from a screen. Studies in cognitive neuroscience using functional MRI imaging have found that the haptic experience of a physical book, the weight, the texture, the spatial sense of progress through pages held between thumb and forefinger, creates what researchers call embodied cognition, in which the body's physical engagement with the reading process becomes part of how the content is understood and remembered. Readers of physical books consistently demonstrate stronger recall of narrative sequence and spatial location of information within a text than equivalent readers of digital versions. The book in your hands is not merely a delivery mechanism for text. The fact that it is in your hands is part of how it works. You feel the weight of it settle against your palm. The cover is smooth, slightly warm from the air of the room. You open it. The pages are dense with text, small printed, with narrow margins and the occasional footnote running like a whisper along the bottom of the page. This is a book that expects to be read slowly. It was made by someone who assumed their reader had time, and who believed, perhaps, that the giving of time to a book was itself a kind of statement about what mattered. Footnotes as a typographic convention were not formalized until the late 17th and early 18th centuries, largely through the work of scholars writing in the emerging tradition of historical criticism, a method that required sources to be cited separately from the main argument to allow readers to distinguish between primary evidence and interpretation. The footnote created a second layer of text running beneath the first, a conversation between the writer's argument and the evidence that supported or complicated it. Literary critic Anthony Grafton, who wrote the definitive history of the footnote, described it as one of the most sophisticated inventions in the history of scholarship, a device that made intellectual honesty visible on the page, transforming the bottom margin from empty space into a place where the writer had to account for themselves. A place where the writer had to account for themselves. You glance down at the footnote running along the bottom of the current page, small, unhurried, doing its quiet work beneath the larger argument above. The candle shifts again. The dust above it stirs. Somewhere in the mass of the building, the deep wood and stone are making their small nightly sounds, the barely audible conversation of old materials releasing the warmth of the day. The sounds that old buildings make as they cool at night, the creaks and ticks and low groans that have been attributed in folklore to everything from spirits to settling foundations, are primarily caused by thermal contraction. As temperature drops, the timber beams, stone lintels, and metal fittings of an old building contract at different rates according to their differing coefficients of thermal expansion. Where two materials meet, a wooden beam set into a stone wall, iron bolts through oak joists. The differential contraction creates friction and sudden small slippages, each one producing a sound. In a library that has stood for centuries, these joints have been making their nightly sounds for so long that the patterns are worn in, familiar, nearly rhythmic. The building speaks the same few words every evening, in the same order, as it has for hundreds of years. The same few words every evening. You listen, and find that you can almost hear the pattern in it. A low tick from somewhere above, a faint groan from the wall behind the shelves. The library settling into night, the way it always does. You have read 3 pages of the book in your lap without recording what they said, which feels like exactly the right way to read in a room like this. Not extracting. Not acquiring. Simply receiving. Letting the words move through you the way the dust moves through the light, without destination, without urgency, simply in motion. Libraries have long been associated with specific effects on mental health and emotional regulation. Researchers studying what has come to be called bibliotherapy, the use of reading as a therapeutic practice, have found that time spent reading in a calm, enclosed environment lowers cortisol levels, reduces heart rate, and can interrupt cycles of ruminative thinking more effectively than equivalent periods of rest without reading. A 2009 study at the University of Sussex found that just 6 minutes of reading reduced participants' stress levels by up to 68%, a more significant reduction than listening to music, taking a walk, or having a cup of tea. The library nook, in this light, is not a passive place. It is actively working on you, every moment you sit within it. Actively working on you. You notice, with a small, warm recognition, that you feel different than you did when you arrived here. Slower. Less effortful. As though some resistance you were not aware of carrying has been quietly set aside. You turn another page. The sound of it is extraordinarily satisfying, that dry, whispering turn, The brief flutter of displaced air, the soft landing of the page against its neighbor. You have turned many pages this evening, and the pleasure of it has not diminished in the slightest. The paper used in books produced before the mid-19th century was made predominantly from rag pulp, recycled linen and cotton fibers from old clothing and textiles, rather than from wood pulp, which became the dominant raw material only after industrial paper-making processes were developed in the 1840s. Rag paper has a significantly longer natural lifespan than wood pulp paper. The high cellulose content and low acid levels in linen and cotton fibers mean that rag paper, if stored in reasonable conditions, can remain flexible and legible for 500 years or more. Wood pulp paper, by contrast, begins to yellow and become brittle within decades due to its high lignin and acid content. This is why books from the 15th century often have pages in better condition than books printed in the 1890s. The older ones were, unknowingly, made to last. The newer ones were not. The older ones made to last without knowing it. You think of the thin, fragile paperback books of the 20th century, already yellowing in their boxes in attics, while the incunabulum on the shelf across the room stands firm and supple after 5 centuries. Longevity was not planned. It was a consequence of the materials that happened to be available, and the craftsmanship that happened to be applied to them. The moonlight has moved again. It has reached the leg of the reading table now and climbs the dark wood in a thin, pale stripe. The candle is very low. You should, perhaps, think about finding another. But for now the two lights together, the warm gold of the flame and the cool silver of the moon, give the room a quality you would not want to disturb by moving. The combination of candlelight and moonlight was the standard reading environment for scholars and writers throughout most of human history, and many accounts from before the 19th century describe this dual illumination in terms that are almost reverent. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century lexicographer who compiled the first comprehensive dictionary of the English language, was known to read by a single candle positioned close to the page, often well into the early hours of the morning, with moonlight supplementing from the window when available. Johnson's biographer James Boswell noted that he found the scholar most animated and most himself in exactly these conditions, in a small circle of candlelight, surrounded by books, in the deep quiet of the night. Most himself. There is something in that. The idea that a person's truest version might be found not in the busy, public hours of the day but in the late, quiet, booklit dark. The word tome, used today to mean any large, heavy, or scholarly book, derives from the Greek tomos, meaning a slice or section cut from a larger whole. In ancient Greek and Roman literary culture, long works were routinely divided across multiple scrolls or physical volumes, each one a tomos, a portion of the complete text. When a Roman scholar referred to the third tome of a philosophical work, they meant literally the third physical section of it, stored as a separate scroll. The word carries within it, all these centuries later, the memory of a time when books were not bounded, self-contained objects but portions of something larger, fragments of a continuous attempt to understand the world, divided only by the practical limits of what a single pair of hands could carry. Fragments of a continuous attempt to understand the world. You look around the room at the shelves and the spines and the long, patient rows of volumes, and the word feels right. Each one a slice of something larger. Each one reaching toward the next. In the great libraries of the Islamic Golden Age, particularly the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 8th century CE and flourishing through the 13th. The library was understood not as a repository but as an active intellectual institution. Scholars were employed not merely to copy and preserve texts but to translate, annotate, debate, and extend them. Works from ancient Greece, Persia, and India were translated into Arabic and subjected to rigorous scholarly commentary, preserving and transmitting knowledge that would otherwise have been entirely lost to the European world during the early medieval period. When the Renaissance rediscovered classical thought, much of what it found had survived only because it had passed through the libraries and minds of Islamic scholars during the centuries when Europe's own libraries held comparatively little. The modern library is, in ways few readers pause to consider, a descendant of Baghdad. A descendant of Baghdad. The room around you is older and stranger than it looks. Every library is. The oldest known library catalog still in existence is a clay tablet from the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur, dating to approximately 2000 BC. The tablet lists the titles of literary and scholarly works held in the temple library, including several hymns, lamentations, and wisdom texts, in a format remarkably similar to a modern library record, with standardized entries organized by genre. The librarian who inscribed this tablet, working 4,000 years ago in a city that no longer exists, was doing something structurally identical to what library catalogers do today, making a record of what was known, so that what was known could be found. So that knowledge, once written, need never be entirely lost again. So that knowledge, once written, need never be entirely lost again. The candle gutters. The moonlight holds 50 facts. The halfway point. The library breathes quietly around you, full of the other 50 still to come. The moth on the page has not moved. It arrived sometime in the last few minutes, drawn, presumably, by the candle, though it seems to have found the open book more interesting. Its wings are the color of old parchment, patterned with small, irregular markings that look, in the candlelight, almost like text. It sits at the center of a paragraph, perfectly still, as though it too is reading. You do not disturb it. There is room enough in this library for both of you. It is one of the quieter revelations of an evening like this one. How much life a room like this contains, even in its stillness. Not just the human life that has passed through it, the hands and eyes and hours of concentration, but the other kind. The small, continuous, unhurried life that goes on in old buildings entirely without permission or acknowledgement, in the spaces between the things we pay attention to. Books are host to a remarkable variety of microscopic and small-scale life. The most significant biological threats to historic paper collections are Lepisma saccharina, the silverfish, and various species of book lice, both of which feed directly on the cellulose and starch found in paper, binding glue, and book cloth. Silverfish, which have existed largely unchanged for over 400 million years, making them one of the oldest insect lineages on Earth, are attracted to the same organic compounds that give old books their characteristic scent. They are, in a very literal sense, drawn to old libraries by the smell of the past. Conservation teams managing historic collections monitor for silverfish activity as a primary indicator of environmental conditions. Their presence signals humidity levels too high for safe long-term storage. Drawn to old libraries by the smell of the past. The moth on the page shifts one wing very slightly, then stills again. Outside in the dark, the old building holds its collected centuries. You find yourself thinking about what it means for something to survive. Not dramatically, not through heroic rescue or deliberate preservation, but simply through the accumulation of small good fortune. The right humidity, the right temperature, the right person placing the right book back on the right shelf. Survival, for most of these volumes, has been a matter of countless unremarkable moments all going quietly right. The single greatest cause of book loss throughout history has not been fire, flood, or deliberate destruction, but simple neglect, the gradual deterioration of volumes stored in conditions too damp, too dry, too warm, or too exposed to light, over periods of decades or centuries during which no one thought to check on them. Historians estimate that the majority of all texts written before the invention of printing have been lost not to any single catastrophic event but to the slow, patient work of time acting on materials that no one was watching carefully enough. The books that survive are not necessarily the most important ones. They are the ones that happen to be in the right place, tended by the right hands, across enough generations to make it here. The ones that happen to be in the right place. You look around the shelves with something approaching tenderness. Every volume here is a small improbability. A series of survivals strung together across time. The candle has burned so low now that you have reached for the spare one, found in the brass holder on the side table, exactly where such things are always found in rooms like this, and lit it from the dying flame of the first. There is something quietly ceremonial about that transfer of fire. Something that feels older than the room. The transfer of flame from one candle to another, using the dying light of one to kindle the next, is one of the oldest metaphors in human intellectual culture. The Roman philosopher Lucretius used it in the 1st century BC to describe the transmission of knowledge across generations, each mind lighting the next from what it received, the flame continuous even as the individual candles change. The same image appears independently in Buddhist, Hindu, and Confucian philosophical traditions, suggesting that something about the candle's particular quality of transmission, fire given without diminishment, light shared without loss, resonates across cultures and centuries as an unusually apt description of how learning moves through time. The new candle beside you burns with a flame that is, in the most literal sense, continuous with every candle ever lit from another in this room. The flame continuous. The individual candles changing. The moth lifts from the page without warning and spirals up into the dark above the new candle. Gone. The page it sat on is unmarked, untouched, exactly as it was before. As though the moth were never there. You lean forward and read the paragraph it was sitting on. The practice of reading by touch, developed as a formal system by Louis Braille in 1824, when he was just 15 years old, building on an earlier military system of night writing, transformed the relationship between the physical book and the reader's body in ways that continue to be explored today. Braille's system uses a grid of raised dots pressed into paper, each combination representing a letter or character, allowing the fingers to read across the surface of the page. Research comparing reading rates and comprehension in experienced Braille readers with those of sighted readers has found that skilled Braille readers can achieve reading speeds and retention levels comparable to visual reading. The brain's language processing systems are equally well served by tactile input as by visual. The book, it turns out, does not require the eye. It requires only a surface, a code, and a mind willing to receive it. A surface, a code, and a mind willing to receive it. The simplest possible description of what a book is. And somehow also the most complete. You turn a few more pages of the volume in your lap, not reading now, just moving through it, feeling the rhythm of the paper under your fingers, watching the text scroll past like something seen from a slow-moving vehicle. The footnotes at the bottom of each page come and go. The chapter headings appear and recede. The book has a shape, felt in the hands as much as understood by the mind, and you are aware of it now in a way you were not when you first picked it up. The chapter divisions we take for granted in modern books were not a standard feature of ancient texts. Early Greek and Roman manuscripts were often written in continuous prose without breaks, headings, or paragraph divisions, a format called scriptura continua, in which not even spaces between words were used. Reading such a text required active parsing with every line, the reader mentally separating words and clauses without any visual assistance from the layout of the page. The introduction of word spacing, paragraph breaks, and eventually chapter divisions across the early medieval period fundamentally changed not just how books looked but how they could be used, enabling readers to navigate, skim, return to specific sections, and quote accurately with far greater ease. The chapter is not a natural unit of thought. It is a technology, invented to make thought accessible. The chapter as technology. You glance at the chapter heading at the top of the current page and feel, for the first time, the full weight of what it is doing there, holding a door open for you, marking where you are, making it possible to find your way back. The new candle has found its rhythm now, the pool of wax spreading slowly, the flame steady and unhurried. The dust above it turns in its familiar convective spiral. The room has settled into night fully and completely. There is no sense of the outside world here. No traffic, no weather, no urgency. Only this, the warm circle of light, the pages, the patient shelves. The smell of a freshly printed new book, quite different from the scent of an old one, is produced primarily by volatile organic compounds released by the ink, adhesives, and paper coatings used in modern printing. The most significant contributors are glycols in the ink, acetates in the binding adhesive, and hydrogen peroxide compounds released as the paper coating cures after printing. While less complex than the multi-layered chemistry of an old book scent, the smell of a new book triggers strong emotional and memory responses in many readers, responses that neuroscientists have linked to the powerful associative memory networks formed during early reading experiences in childhood. The smell of a new book does not smell of history. It smells of anticipation, of a text not yet read, a world not yet entered. Anticipation. You hold your own book a little differently for a moment, aware of it as an object with a smell, a temperature, a weight. An object that existed in the world long before you picked it up, and will exist long after you set it down. The largest book ever produced, by physical dimensions, is a handcrafted manuscript known as the Codex Gigas, the giant book, created in a Bohemian monastery in the early 13th century. It measures approximately 92 centimeters tall, 50 centimeters wide, and 22 centimeters thick, weighs around 74 kilograms, and contains 310 vellum leaves believed to have required the skins of 160 donkeys or calves. It is famous not only for its size but for a full-page illustration of the devil, one of the most striking images in medieval manuscript art, and for the legend that it was written in a single night by a monk who sold his soul to complete it. Analysis of the handwriting and ink composition has suggested it was in fact the work of a single scribe over a period of perhaps 20 to 30 years. The legend of the single knight, the soul, the devil, that is the story the book attracted. The truth, one person, 20 years, 74 kilograms of patient work, is, if anything, more extraordinary. 20 years of patient work. You turn a page. The sound of it is, as always, quietly perfect. Paper tears more easily in one direction than the other because of the grain direction established during manufacture, the alignment of cellulose fibers along the direction of the paper's travel through the forming machine. Tearing along the grain produces a clean, relatively straight edge. Tearing against it produces a ragged, irregular one. Printers, bookbinders, and paper craftspeople have always worked with this directionality, folding and cutting along the grain wherever possible to produce cleaner results and longer-lasting bindings. The grain direction of paper is invisible to the eye but present in every sheet, a hidden structure running through the material like the grain of wood, a reminder that even the most processed and refined of materials retains something of the directional logic of its making. A hidden structure running through the material. You press the page gently between your fingers and feel, or imagine you feel, the faint directionality of its fibers. The invisible logic of its construction, still present after all these years. The word paper derives from papyrus, the reed plant native to the Nile Delta from which ancient Egyptians produced a writing surface by slicing the pith of the stem into thin strips, pressing them together in overlapping layers, and drying them under weight. Despite the shared name, papyrus and paper are fundamentally different materials. Papyrus is a mat of interlocked plant strips, not a sheet of processed fibers, and it behaves differently under humidity, light, and mechanical stress. The Egyptian papyrus scrolls that survive in museum collections today, some more than 3,000 years old, owe their survival largely to the extreme aridity of the desert climate in which they were buried. The same documents, stored in the conditions of a northern European library, would likely have disintegrated within centuries. Every material has its climate. Every text has the landscape it was made for. Every text has the landscape it was made for. You think of the papyrus scrolls in their desert tombs, and of the vellum manuscripts in their cold stone monasteries, and of the rag paper books on the shelves around you in their candlelit English room. Each one finding, or being found by, the conditions that would keep it. The human eye, when reading in low-light conditions such as candlelight, relies increasingly on the rod cells at the periphery of the retina rather than the cone cells at its center. Rod cells are more sensitive to low light but cannot detect color, which is why objects in dim rooms appear to lose their color at the edges of vision. This shift in visual processing, from the color-sensitive fovea to the grayscale periphery, gives candlelit reading a particular quality of soft-edged focus. The text directly in view remains sharp and readable, while everything surrounding it softens into warm, indistinct shadow. The cone of candlelight that medieval and early modern readers read within was not merely a practical limitation. It was, neurologically, a frame, directing the reader's full attention to the page in a way that modern ambient lighting, which illuminates everything equally, fundamentally does not. A frame directing attention to the page. You look up from your book and notice, as though for the first time, how completely the candlelight has narrowed the world to this. The table. The open book. The warm circle of the flame. Everything else soft and distant and beside the point. 60 facts. 60 lights held against the dark. The night is deep around the library now, and the shelves are very still, and there is nowhere else you need to be. There is a door in the shelving that you did not notice until now. It is set flush with the bookcase on either side of it, so that the spines of books continue across its surface without interruption. A shelf of volumes on the door itself, mounted on a narrow strip of wood that swings with it when it opens. Someone built this door to be invisible. Someone wanted a room beyond this room that the casual visitor would not think to look for. It stands just slightly open. A finger's width of darkness beyond the frame. You do not go through it. Not yet. There is something right about pausing at a threshold like this, about acknowledging the door before you decide what to do with it. Libraries have always had rooms within rooms. Layers within layers. The obvious collection, and then behind it, deeper in, the things that required more intention to find. Many historic libraries contained inner libraries, restricted collections within the main collection, accessible only to senior scholars, clergy, or trusted members of the institution. In medieval cathedral libraries, certain texts considered too dangerous, too heretical, or too explicit for general reading were kept in locked cabinets called armaria or in separate locked rooms, accessible only with the permission of the librarian or bishop. The Vatican Apostolic Library maintains such a restricted section to this day, the Reserva, containing manuscripts and documents deemed too sensitive for general scholarly access. The idea that a library might hold a room that not everyone is permitted to enter is not a Gothic invention. It is a structural feature of libraries throughout history, an acknowledgement that knowledge has always been understood, by those who kept it, as something not entirely safe to leave lying around. Not entirely safe to leave lying around. You look at the thin strip of darkness beyond the door and feel, quietly and without alarm, the truth of that. Knowledge has weight. Some of it requires a room of its own. The new candle you lit earlier is burning steadily. Its light reaches the door but does not go beyond it. The darkness inside stays dark. The books on the door's false shelf face outward into the room, their spines patient and opaque. You turn away from the door, back toward the reading table, back toward the open book and the familiar warmth of the room you know. There is enough here for now. There is always enough here. The practice of ex libris, bookplates, dates to at least the 15th century and represents one of the oldest forms of personalized printed art. A bookplate is a small label, typically pasted to the inside front cover of a book, bearing the name or heraldic device of the book's owner. The earliest known printed bookplate dates to around 1470 and belonged to a German knight. By the 17th and 18th centuries, commissioning a custom-designed bookplate from an engraver had become a mark of cultivated ownership among European aristocracy and scholars, with designs ranging from simple armorial crests to elaborate allegorical scenes. When you find an old bookplate inside a volume, you are looking at the moment a particular human being decided that this book was theirs, that they wanted to leave a mark saying so, and that the mark should be beautiful. The moment a person decided a book was theirs, and wanted to leave a beautiful mark saying so. You think of how many of the volumes around you might carry that declaration inside their covers, small, private announcements of belonging, pressed against the pages in the dark. The floorboards near the window creak in their nightly register. The candle flame bends slightly, then recovers. Outside, far away, something moves through the darkness, a wind through trees, perhaps, or an animal in the garden, and the building absorbs it without comment. You reach for a book you have not yet touched. This one is narrow, almost pamphlet thin, with soft paper boards for a cover and a title handwritten in faded ink rather than printed. It has the feeling of something made in a hurry, or made privately, for an audience of one. Before professional publishing existed, the primary means of circulating written work was through manuscript circulation. Hand-copied texts passed between readers and private networks of scholars, friends, and patrons. This system was far more personal and selective than print publication, and it persisted long after Gutenberg's press made printing commercially viable. Many writers deliberately chose manuscript circulation over print for sensitive or controversial work, knowing that a copied letter or treatise passed among trusted readers carried far less risk of censorship or prosecution than a printed book distributed commercially. The poet John Donne, for instance, never published his poems during his lifetime. They circulated in manuscript among his circle, copied by hand, shared and read in private. His collected poems were not printed until after his death. The handwritten book in your hands may carry within it the memory of exactly this kind of intimacy, knowledge shared between known and trusted people, in a world where printing everything was neither possible nor always wise. Knowledge shared between known and trusted people. The thin book sits lightly in your hands, private and confiding. You set it down gently and look around the room again, the full sweep of it, the shelves rising into shadow, the candle holding its small warm territory, the door in the bookcase still standing slightly open at the edge of your vision. The room has a quality now that it didn't have when you first arrived, something harder to name than comfort or warmth. Familiarity, perhaps. The particular feeling of a space that has begun to know you back. Research into the psychology of place attachment, the emotional bonds humans form with specific physical spaces, has found that enclosed, quiet environments associated with positive intellectual or emotional experiences are among the most powerfully remembered locations in a person's life. Studies of autobiographical memory have shown that people recall details of beloved reading spaces, the exact quality of the light, the arrangement of the furniture, the particular smell of the room, with unusual precision and warmth, often decades after they last visited them. Neuroscientists believe this is connected to the fact that reading deeply and place experience deeply both recruit the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for both spatial memory and emotional consolidation. The library nook does not merely shelter reading. It becomes part of the memory of what was read, inseparable from it, woven into the text itself. inseparable from the text, woven in. You think of every book you have ever loved and find, testing the idea that you can almost always remember where you were when you read it. The chair, the light, the quality of the air. The room inside the room of the book. The oldest known purpose-built reading room, a space designed specifically and exclusively for the act of reading, rather than for storage, worship, or general study, is believed to be the reading room of the Biblioteca Malatestiana in Cesena, Italy, completed in 1454. Its architect, Matteo Nudi, designed the space with a series of windows positioned to provide consistent natural light to each of its reading benches throughout the day, with the benches themselves oriented to minimize glare on the page. The relationship between light and reading was understood by its builders as an architectural problem to be solved with the same seriousness as structural stability or acoustic comfort. The room was built not to contain books but to serve readers. The books were arranged around the reader's needs rather than the other way around. That inversion, placing the reader, not the collection, at the center, was, in 1454, a radical idea. The reader at the center. You feel the truth of it in the chair you are sitting in the angle of the lamp, in the height of the shelves that bring the books to your hands rather than requiring you to reach. Someone thought about you before you arrived. The candle makes a small sound, a faint tick as a bubble of air escapes through the wax, and the flame jumps once, briefly, then steadies. The dust motes above it scatter and resettle. The room adjusts imperceptibly, the way rooms do, and returns to itself. The word codex, used to describe the bound page format of the book as opposed to the scroll, derives from the Latin word for the trunk of a tree, caudex, referring to the wooden tablets that were bound together as an early precursor to the modern book. Romans used wax-coated wooden tablets strapped together at the spine for everyday writing, notes, accounts, letters, and this bound tablet format was the direct ancestor of the parchment codex that replaced the scroll for literary and scholarly texts from roughly the 2nd century CE onward. The shift from scroll to codex was one of the most consequential format changes in the history of written knowledge. The codex allowed random access to any page without unrolling, could be closed to mark a place, carried more text in a more compact form, and was far more durable in daily use. We still live, every time we open a book, inside the decision that was made in Rome 2,000 years ago to bind the pages at one edge and leave the other free. Still living inside a decision made 2,000 years ago. The book in your lap confirms it, its spine, its pages, its particular way of opening to you, all inherited from a Roman wooden tablet, from the trunk of a tree. Dust motes, despite their apparent weightlessness, are subject to a phenomenon called gravitational settling, the very slow downward drift of particles under gravity when the air around them is perfectly still. In a sealed room with no air movement, a dust mote of average size would take between 1 and 8 hours to drift from ceiling height to the floor. In practice, rooms are never perfectly still. Convective air movement from bodies, candles, and subtle temperature differentials keeps most particles in continuous circulation. But in the deepest hours of the night, in a room where the candle has burned low and no one has moved for a long time, the air grows still enough that gravitational settling begins to win, and the dust very slowly, very gently, begins to fall. The library at its quietest is a room in which the dust is, infinitesimally, descending. A room in which the dust is infinitesimally descending. The thought has a quality of tenderness to it, the idea of the library at its most still, everything slowly, gently finding its rest. The binding of a book, the structure that holds its pages together and attaches them to the cover, has evolved through at least a dozen distinct major formats across history, from the Coptic stitch of early Christian manuscripts to the case binding of the modern hardcover. Among the most enduring and technically sophisticated is the long stitch binding, in which a single continuous thread links the pages directly to the cover without the use of adhesive, creating a book that can be opened completely flat at any page without stress to the structure, and which, if the thread is of good quality, can last for centuries of regular use. Conservators studying books that have required the least repair over their lifetimes have found that long stitch and other non-adhesive bindings consistently outperform glued structures, suggesting that the oldest solutions are often the most durable. The book that lasts is the one held together by thread, by something flexible, not rigid, by something that can move with the page rather than against it. Held together by thread, by something that can move with the page rather than against it. You feel the spine of the book in your hands flex very slightly as you turn a page, and understand, in the way that only physical understanding can give you, exactly what that means. The reading wheel, a large mechanical device resembling a Ferris wheel laid on its side, with multiple book rests mounted around its circumference, was invented in the 16th century by the Italian engineer Agostino Ramelli and described in his 1588 work Le Diverse et Artificios Machine. Designed to allow a single scholar to consult multiple large volumes simultaneously without moving from their seat, it used a system of epicyclic gearing to keep each book rest horizontal as the wheel rotated, so that the open books remained flat and readable regardless of their position on the wheel. The reading wheel was, in essence, a 16th century attempt to solve the same problem that the modern browser tab solves: how to work across multiple sources at once without losing your place in any of them. The problem of how to hold many things open simultaneously is, it seems, perennial. The problem of how to hold many things open simultaneously. You look at the 3 books now spread open across the reading table and feel, across 4 centuries, a precise solidarity with the scholar who commissioned a wheel. The faint blue tinge visible at the very edge of white pages when held at a certain angle to the light is not an optical illusion, but a real optical phenomenon. Many papers, both historic and modern, contain trace amounts of optical brightening agents or naturally fluorescent mineral compounds that absorb ultraviolet light and re-emit it as visible blue light, making the paper appear whiter and brighter than it would otherwise. In older papers, this effect comes from naturally occurring compounds in the mineral-treated sizing used to prepare the sheet's surface. The blue edge of the page is the paper announcing, very quietly, that it has been absorbing invisible light all along and turning it into something you can see. Even at rest, the pages are doing something. Even at rest, the pages are doing something. You look at the edge of the book in your hands, tilted very slightly toward the candle, and there it is. The faintest, most delicate blue. The page, breathing light back at you. 70 facts. The night has grown very deep and very still. The door in the bookcase stands open by its finger's width, keeping its secret a little longer. The dust has begun, in the stillest corners of the room, its slow and patient descent. There is so much still to find here. There always is. The library has grown very quiet. Not the quiet of earlier in the evening, which had the texture of anticipation, of a room waiting to be more fully inhabited. This is a deeper quiet. The quiet that arrives only when the night has committed fully to itself, when the last sounds of the outside world have faded past the point of hearing, and what remains is not silence exactly but the particular resonance of a very old room, holding still. You have been here long enough now that the room has stopped feeling like a place you entered and started feeling like a place you belong to. The candle knows your presence. The shelves have accepted you. The dust has settled around you, arranging itself in the slight disturbances your breathing makes, your warmth makes, without complaint. You pick up the book that has been sitting closed on the corner of the table since you arrived, the one you kept meaning to reach for and kept not quite reaching. Heavy in the hands. Cloth-bound, dark green, with no title visible on the cover. You open it to a random page somewhere near the middle, the way you sometimes open a book when you want it to tell you something rather than when you want to tell it what to find. There is a particular kind of courage in that, in opening a book without a destination. In trusting that whatever page you arrive at will have something in it worth the arriving. Most reading is purposeful. We look for the passage we remember, the chapter we were told about, the answer to a question we already know how to ask. But occasional, directionless reading, the kind where you simply let the book open where it will, asks something different of you. It asks you to be ready for whatever is there, without the preparation of knowing in advance what it will be. The page you have opened to is dense with a single long paragraph. No breaks. No chapter heading. Just words, running together in a dark, patient river across the page. You begin to read. Typography, the art and science of arranging printed type, has a profound and largely unconscious effect on how readers experience and process text. Studies in reading psychology have found that serif typefaces, which carry small decorative strokes at the ends of letter forms, are processed slightly faster in long-form text than sans serif faces, because the serifs create a subtle horizontal visual line that guides the eye along each row of text. Conversely, sans serif typefaces test higher for legibility at small sizes and in low-contrast conditions. The typeface of a book is not a neutral choice. It is a set of invisible instructions to the reader's eye, shaping the pace and ease of reading in ways the reader almost never consciously perceives. Every book you have ever read has been, in part, guiding you without your knowledge. Guiding you without your knowledge. You look at the typeface on the page before you, the particular shape of its letters, the spacing of its lines, and see it, briefly and strangely, as something other than transparent. As a thing with intentions. The words resume their transparency almost immediately. That is the mark of a good typeface. It disappears into the reading. The first typeface designed specifically for comfortable extended reading, as opposed to display or decorative use, is generally considered to be Aldus, created by the Venetian printer Aldus Manutius in the late 15th century. Manutius, who founded the Aldine Press in 1494, was the first publisher to produce affordable, pocket-sized books for a general educated readership rather than large, expensive volumes for institutions and wealthy collectors. To fit more text onto smaller pages without sacrificing legibility, he commissioned a new italic typeface, based on the handwriting of the Venetian humanist scholar Bartolomeo Sanvito, that was narrower than the upright Roman type of the day, allowing more characters per line. The pocket book, the italic typeface, and the concept of publishing for a broad reading public were all, in their modern form, invented simultaneously by the same man, in the same Venetian workshop, within a decade. The same man. The same decade. The pocket book you might carry on a train, the italic emphasis in the sentence you are reading, the idea that books should be affordable and accessible, all of it flows from one workshop in Venice, 500 years ago. You turn the page. The long paragraph continues on the other side, uninterrupted, as though the page break were simply a pause for breath. The white space at the center of an open book, the gap between the two facing pages, where the paper curves into the binding, is called the gutter, and managing it is one of the fundamental challenges of book design. Text or images that fall too close to the gutter become difficult to read as the pages curve away from the eye, and in books that cannot be opened flat, inner margins must be made wider than outer margins to compensate. In illuminated manuscripts, scribes and artists were acutely aware of the gutter and typically avoided placing any significant text or imagery within it. The gutter is the book's one truly unreadable space, a built-in silence running through every volume from its first page to its last, the dark seam where two halves of a thought are held apart by the binding that joins them. A built-in silence running through every volume. You look at the gutter of the open book and see it differently now, not as absence but as structure. The hinge on which meaning turns. The candle beside you makes a small, settling sound. You have been sitting with this particular flame long enough to learn its habits, the slight lean it takes when your breathing passes near it, the way it brightens very briefly just before the wax around the wick shifts and resettles. A candle, attended to closely enough, has a personality. Wax used in candles has a measurable effect on the documents near which it burns. Studies of historic manuscripts and books stored in rooms regularly illuminated by candles have found traces of stearic acid, the primary fatty acid in tallow and beeswax, deposited in the surface fibers of nearby paper and parchment. In small quantities, this acts as a mild preservative, reducing the paper's absorption of atmospheric moisture. In larger quantities, accumulated over centuries of proximity to candles, it can cause yellowing and surface brittleness. The candle that illuminated the scribe's work was, simultaneously, leaving its own slow chemical signature on the manuscript being written. Every reading, every copying session, every long evening of study by candlelight was also, invisibly, an act of alteration. The light changed what it touched. The light changed what it touched. You look at the page before you and wonder briefly what this particular room's centuries of candles have left in its paper, what invisible residue of all those evenings of study has been folded into the fibers of these books. The practice of dog-earing, folding down the corner of a page to mark one's place, dates to at least the 16th century and has been a source of controversy among book lovers ever since. The term itself appears in print from the early 18th century, comparing the folded corner to the floppy ear of certain dog breeds. Conservators and archivists universally discourage the practice, as the repeated folding of a page corner creates stress fractures in the paper fibers that eventually cause the corner to detach entirely. Bookmarks, strips of ribbon, leather, or paper placed between pages rather than folded into them, are known to have been used at least as early as the 6th century CE, long predating the printed book. The oldest surviving bookmark is a woven silk ribbon attached to a 6th century Coptic manuscript, still in place after 1500 years, still doing its quiet, faithful work. Still doing its quiet, faithful work. 1500 years of holding a page. You reach out and straighten the small ribbon bookmark tucked between the pages of the book at the table's edge, and feel, in this simple gesture, something passing between your hands and a very long history of the same small care. Sound, it turns out, can damage books. Studies conducted by acoustic researchers working with library conservation teams have found that sustained exposure to loud sound, above approximately 90 decibels, causes measurable vibration in paper fibers, accelerating microfractures in aged and brittle material. At lower volumes, the effect is negligible, but in historic libraries situated near construction sites, busy roads, or concert venues, the cumulative vibrational stress on fragile collections over years of exposure has been found to contribute to deterioration. This discovery has led some major libraries, including the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, to install seismic and vibrational monitoring systems in their most sensitive storage areas. The library's demand for quiet is not merely cultural. It is, for the books themselves, a matter of physical survival. The library's demand for quiet, a matter of survival. The silence of the room around you is not passive. It is protective. The hush that feels like courtesy to you is, for the books, something closer to medicine. The concept of intellectual property, the idea that a person can own the content of their mind as distinct from the physical object in which it is recorded, did not exist in law until the British Statute of and in 1710, widely considered the world's first copyright law. Before this, a book's content belonged, legally, to whoever physically possessed or had copied it. Medieval scriptoria regularly copied texts without permission or attribution, and the manuscripts they produced were considered entirely theirs. The author, in the pre-copyright world, had no legal claim on their own words once those words had been written down and handed to another. The idea that writing belongs to the writer, that the words on a page carry with them a property right that travels with the text across every copy ever made, is barely 300 years old. Barely 300 years old. You look at the name on the title page of the book in your lap, the author's name, printed beneath the title in smaller type, and consider what it means. What it meant for someone, somewhere, to establish in law that this name stays attached to these words. That the words do not drift free. The candle dips. You cup your hand around it briefly, shielding the flame, and it steadies. The weight of a book changes over time. As paper ages, it loses moisture to the surrounding atmosphere and becomes fractionally lighter. A book stored in a consistently dry environment for 100 years may weigh measurably less than it did when new, not from any loss of material, but from the slow departure of the water molecules held within its fibers. Conversely, a book stored in a damp environment gains weight as its fibers absorb atmospheric moisture. Conservators weighing historic books as part of condition assessments can detect environmental history in these measurements. A book that is heavier than its paper composition would predict has spent time in humid conditions, and one that is lighter than expected has likely spent decades in unusual dryness. The book carries its past in its weight, the way all things carry their past, invisibly, in how much of themselves remains. In how much of themselves remains. You hold the book in both hands for a moment, feeling its particular heft, its history of rooms compressed into grams. The shelving of books vertically, spines outward, standing upright, is actually a relatively recent convention in library history. For much of the medieval period, books were stored flat, in horizontal stacks, or lying on their sides with the spine facing inward and the foredge facing out, sometimes with the title written on the foredge rather than the spine. The vertical, spine-out arrangement became standard only in the 17th century as collections grew large enough that stacking books horizontally became impractical, and as the convention of titling spines became established. Earlier library visitors navigated their collections by the foredge, reading the titles written along the page edges, or simply knowing by memory and long familiarity where each volume sat. The spine-out library, which now seems so inevitable and obvious, had to be invented. You look at the rows of spines facing you from across the room and understand them, suddenly, as a choice, as the settled outcome of centuries of trial and adjustment, one arrangement among several that were tried and found wanting before this one. The average book, read once, will have its pages turned approximately 250 to 350 times, depending on its length and the reader's pace. A well-loved book read multiple times over decades may have its pages turned thousands of times across its lifetime. Each turn leaves the paper fractionally more worn at the corner touched, the fibers at the lower edge very slightly more compressed, the ink marginally more abraded from the friction of the page's movement against its neighbor. The most read pages in a much-loved book can sometimes be identified by conservators simply by their condition: softer, slightly thinner, more transparent at the edges than the pages turned only once or twice. The book keeps count. Silently, materially, permanently. Every reading is recorded in the body of the book itself. Every reading recorded in the body of the book. You turn the page, the 200 and something th turn of this particular volume, or the 2000th, you cannot know which, and the paper receives it as it always has. Quietly. Without resistance. 80 facts. The night is at its deepest. The candle is steady. The room is yours. The darkness outside the window is not quite what it was. You notice it the way you notice the moment a room's temperature changes. Not in the instant it happens, but in the moment your body registers that something is different from before and has been for a little while. The black beyond the glass has deepened, then thinned, then deepened again, and now sits at a color that is not quite any color. That particular non-blue of the sky in the half-hour before first light, when the night has agreed to end but the day has not yet arrived to replace it. The candle still burns. Its flame, which ruled this room without competition all through the long hours since evening, now shares the air with something older and larger than itself. The two lights are not yet in conflict. They simply coexist, each occupying a different register of the room, the candle warm and near in particular, the pre-dawn light cool and diffuse and vast, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You have been here all night. The thought lands with a quiet weight that is not tiredness, or not only tiredness, but something more like completion. The way you feel at the last page of a book that asked a great deal of you and gave back more than you expected. There is a word in Portuguese, madrugada. That describes this exact hour. The small hours before dawn, when night and morning briefly share the same sky. English has no single equivalent. It is one of the gaps in the language, a space where a feeling exists that the words have not fully caught up to yet. Other languages do better with the interior life of ours. The Japanese kamaribi for sunlight filtering through leaves. The Danish hygge for the warm contentment of an enclosed and cozy space. And madrugada for exactly this, the hour you are in now, which belongs to neither darkness nor light, but to the pause between them. The books around you look different in this light. Everything does. The transition from darkness to first light affects paper in a measurable way. As pre-dawn humidity levels rise, part of the natural daily cycle in which outdoor temperatures drop to their lowest point just before sunrise, causing moisture in the air to condense, paper absorbs fractionally more atmospheric water, becoming very slightly heavier, softer, and more supple than it was in the drier air of the night. Conservators and master bookbinders working with historic paper have noted this effect for centuries, with some craftspeople preferring to work with certain delicate materials in the early morning hours precisely because the slight increase in paper suppleness reduces the risk of cracking or tearing. The books around you, in this pre-dawn hour, are at their most physically pliant. They have absorbed the night's last breath. At their most physically pliant, you press your palm gently against the open page and feel, or imagine you feel, something faintly yielding in the surface. The paper receiving the morning before you do. Dawn has been a charged and specific time for readers and scholars throughout history. In the monastic tradition that produced so many of the books now shelved in libraries like this one, the hour of lauds, the morning prayer sung at first light, was immediately preceded by the Lectio Divina, the slow, meditative reading of sacred texts that structured the monk's intellectual and spiritual life. Monks who rose before dawn to read by lamplight before lauds were described in monastic chronicles as engaged in the most productive and focused reading of their day, with the pre-dawn stillness considered uniquely conducive to deep comprehension. The early morning reader is not a modern type, the scholar at the desk before dawn, with one candle burning and the window beginning to pale, is one of the most recurring figures in the entire history of written culture. One of the most recurring figures in all of written culture. You are, in this moment, that figure. And the figure was always here. The candle shortens toward its base. It will not last the morning. But it has done its work, held the dark at bay for the hours when the dark needed holding, given warmth and focus and the particular quality of attention that firelight asks of the things around it. You do not move to replace it. Let it finish what it started. In the history of libraries, fire has been both the primary means of illumination and the greatest single threat to survival. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the most famous library lost in history, though the historical reality of a single catastrophic burning has been significantly overstated by popular accounts, involved at minimum a gradual decline over centuries of reduced funding, political instability, and incremental losses, rather than one decisive blaze. More commonly, historic library fires have been small, accidental, and devastating in proportion to their scale: a knocked candle, an unattended lamp, a chimney fire that spread to an adjacent room. The Cottonian Library in London lost 114 manuscripts to a fire in 1731. including the only known illustrated copy of an Anglo-Saxon heroic poem. Those 114 books represented not just their own content but all the questions about the past that can now never be answered because the answers burned. Questions that can now never be answered because the answers burned. The candle flame throws a small shadow on the wall, and for just a moment you are aware of how close the light and the danger have always been to each other, in rooms like this one, across all the centuries that produced these books. It is one of the stranger ironies of the library's history, that the very thing that made it possible to read after dark, the thing that extended the hours of scholarship deep into the night for 1,000 years, was also the thing most likely to end the library entirely. Every great monastic library, every cathedral chapter house, every scholarly collection built up across decades of careful acquisition, lived its whole life within reach of the flame. The care that went into copying those manuscripts, into preparing the parchment, and grinding the pigments, and ruling the lines, all of it could be undone in minutes by a knocked candle, a chimney spark, an unattended wick. That so many books survived is not the expected outcome. It is the extraordinary one. You look at the flame with a tenderness that surprises you. The smell of old books, that complex, warm, faintly sweet scent that has accompanied you all through this long evening, is detected by the olfactory bulb, a structure in the brain that connects directly to the amygdala and hippocampus, the regions most closely associated with emotional memory and spatial navigation. This is why smell triggers memory more immediately and more viscerally than any other sense. It bypasses the cortical processing that mediates other sensory experience, and arrives directly in the emotional and memory centers without filtering. When the scent of old paper transports you, without warning, to a specific moment in your past, a childhood library, a grandparent's study, a room you haven't thought of in years, that is not nostalgia or imagination. It is the architecture of your brain, connecting the present smell to its first recorded meaning before your conscious mind has had time to catch up. Before your conscious mind has had time to catch up. Somewhere in the warm air of this room, the night's accumulated scent reaches you again, vanillin and aged cellulose and old leather and candle wax, and something shifts very quietly in your chest. The window has grown lighter by another degree. The shapes of the garden beyond the glass are beginning to separate themselves from the general darkness. A hedge, a stone wall, the bare branch of a tree lifting against the paling sky. Paper, in sufficient quantities, is classified as a combustible material but is far less flammable than is commonly assumed. Loose sheets of paper ignite at approximately 233 degrees Celsius. The temperature made famous by Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451, which takes its title from a slightly inaccurate figure of 451 degrees Fahrenheit, or 233 Celsius. However, a tightly bound book is considerably harder to ignite than loose paper because the compressed pages exclude the oxygen necessary for combustion. Firefighters and conservation teams dealing with library fires have found that densely shelved books often survive the edges of a fire's reach with only surface charring, their inner pages intact. The very compression that gives a book its weight also gives it a degree of resistance. The book protects itself by being what it is, dense, close-packed, each page sheltering the next. Each page sheltering the next. The shelves around you, dense and close, breathe that truth into the cooling air. Many historic libraries maintained a position known as the Custos Librorum, the keeper of the books, a role distinct from the librarian in that its primary responsibility was not the organization or lending of the collection, but its physical protection. The custos would make regular night rounds of the library, checking for signs of damp, pest activity, or fire risk, and was sometimes required by institutional charter to sleep in the building itself to ensure continuous protection. At the Bodleian Library in Oxford, newly appointed staff still take an oath that dates in part to 1602, promising among other things not to bring fire or flame into the library. The oath is taken seriously. The Bodleian has no heating system in its oldest reading rooms to this day, a deliberate preservation of the conditions under which the oath was made. No heating, to honor a promise made in 1602. The cold and the dark and the custodian who slept among the books, all of it still present, in some form, in every library that has taken its responsibility seriously enough to feel it as a weight. The candle has reached its last centimeter. The flame floats almost at table level now, the pool of wax wide and still around it. The light it gives is the softest it has been all evening, low and warm and close, barely casting shadows. In the pre-dawn hours, the human brain's production of the sleep-regulating hormone melatonin begins to decline, preparing the body for waking. Simultaneously, core body temperature begins to rise and cortisol levels increase, producing the gradual brightening of alertness associated with morning. Readers who have remained awake through the night often report a paradoxical second clarity of attention in the hour before dawn, a brief, lucid period before accumulated fatigue catches up, in which the mind feels unusually sharp and the contents of whatever has been read through the night seem unusually vivid and present. The scholar who reads all night and finds the last hour the most alive is not imagining it. The body, preparing to wake, offers one final window of receptive attention before the night fully ends. One final window of receptive attention. You are in it now. The book in your hands, the room around you, the pale edge of morning at the window, all of it uncommonly clear. The colophon, from the Greek word for summit or finishing touch, is the inscription placed at the end of a manuscript or early printed book recording information about its production, the scribe's name, the date of completion, the place of writing, sometimes a brief note about the conditions under which the work was done. Colophons are among the most intimate surviving voices from the history of book production. One 15th-century Irish scribe ended his copy of a legal manuscript with the words, "I am very cold tonight." Another, finishing a devotional text in a German monastery, noted that he had completed the work, with 3 fingers writing, but the whole body laboring. The colophon is where the human being behind the book briefly surfaces, where the long act of transmission pauses just long enough to say, "I was here. This cost me something. I finished it anyway. Asterisk. I was here. This cost me something. I finished it anyway." You read the words again, quietly, and feel the long thread of them pulling taut across the centuries. The direction of writing, left to right, right to left, top to bottom, varies across the world's writing systems and was not always fixed even within a single tradition. Early Greek inscriptions were sometimes written in boustrophodon, meaning as the ox plows, alternating direction with each line, so that a reader's eye could travel continuously from left to right across one line and immediately continue right to left across the next without lifting from the surface. The practice mirrors the back and forth movement of an ox pulling a plow across a field, turning at the end of each row. It was efficient, in its way, and its existence is a reminder that even the most fundamental conventions of reading, the direction in which the eye travels across the page, were once open questions, tried in multiple directions before one way settled into habit and became invisible. Before one way settled into habit and became invisible. Outside the window, a bird calls once, a single clear note in the pre-dawn dark. The first voice of the returning morning. Libraries have, in almost every culture that has produced them, been associated with a particular quality of time, a sense that within their walls, the ordinary passage of hours is suspended or altered. This perception has been studied by environmental psychologists, who have found that enclosed, low stimulation spaces with consistent temperature, low light variation, and high acoustic dampening disrupt the brain's normal time estimation mechanisms. Without the external cues, changing light, ambient noise, the sound of movement, that the brain uses to track the passage of time, duration becomes difficult to judge accurately. Readers in library nooks consistently underestimate how long they have been sitting. The library does not make time pass faster. It makes the passing of time less legible. It removes the clock from the room without removing the hours, and lets you inhabit them fully, without watching them go. Without watching them go. You have been here all night. The room gave you everything it had, its light, its scent, its silence, its long patience, and you received it, page by page, hour by quiet hour. The morning is almost here. The candle is almost gone. 90 facts. 10 more, and the night will be complete. The candle has gone out. Not dramatically, no gust, no sudden dark. It simply reached the end of what it had, and the flame decreased and trembled and then was gone, leaving a thin thread of smoke that rose straight up through the still air for a moment before dissolving into the room. The smell of extinguished wax joins the library's other scents, the paper, the leather, the old wood, the morning, and becomes part of them. The room is not dark. The window holds the first full light of dawn now, and it falls across everything differently from how the candle did. Where the candle gave the room its warm particularity, its shadows, its depth, its sense of enclosed focus, the dawn gives it breadth. The shelves extend further than they seem to at night. The ceiling is higher. The books on the far wall, barely visible in the candlelight hours ago, are now perfectly legible in their rows, their spines reading from across the room with quiet clarity. The same room, entirely changed by the quality of its light. You sit for a moment without moving, letting the transition settle. There is something you want to hold on to before the day begins, some quality of the night's long hours that you already sense is beginning to thin at its edges, the way dreams thin when you try too deliberately to remember them. You reach for the book in your lap. There are a few pages left. The final pages of a book have been shown by reading researchers to produce measurably different neurological activity than earlier sections. As readers approach the end of a narrative or extended argument, the brain increases its predictive processing, generating stronger and more frequent anticipatory signals about what is coming, heightening attention and emotional engagement simultaneously. This is why the last chapters of a beloved book are so often read more slowly than the middle chapters, despite the natural pull toward resolution. The reader is both hurrying toward the ending and unconsciously resisting it, knowing that once the last page is turned, this particular experience of this particular book can never be had for the first time again. The end of a book is the only part you can only read once. The only part you can only read once. You slow your eyes on the page. Deliberate, unhurried. Taking your time with what remains. The tradition of leaving the last page of a handwritten manuscript intentionally blank, a practice found across medieval European, Islamic, and East Asian manuscript traditions, served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected the final page of written text from damage during handling and storage. It left space for later owners to add their own notes, dates, or dedications. And it created a formal boundary between the world of the text and the world beyond it, a threshold of white space that said clearly and without words, "Here is where the writing ends." The blank last page is not emptiness. It is a deliberate silence, made by hand, held open for whatever the reader needs to bring to it. A deliberate silence, held open. You turn to the last written page of the book in your hands and see, beyond it, exactly that, a page of unmarked cream paper, slightly warmer in tone than the pages before it, catching the dawn light and holding it softly. Outside, a second bird has joined the first. Then a third. The garden beyond the window is assembling its morning, one voice at a time. Birdsong at dawn, the dawn chorus, occurs because songbirds begin vocalizing in the low light of early morning when it is too dark to forage effectively, but acoustics are optimal for long-distance sound transmission. In the cool, still pre-dawn air, sound travels further and with less distortion than during the warmer, windier hours of the day, making the dawn chorus both biologically strategic and acoustically extraordinary. The same atmospheric conditions that carried birdsong so clearly in the early morning, cool, still, dense air, also carried the sound of a page turning further through a quiet room. The library at dawn shares its acoustic physics with the garden beyond its windows. Both are at their most perfectly quiet, and both are, for that reason, at their most alive with the sounds that stillness makes possible. Both are, for that reason, most alive with the sounds that stillness makes possible. The page turn and the birdsong. The same quiet air receiving both. The experience of finishing a beloved book, sometimes called post-book depression by readers and studied under the clinical term end-of-series grief by psychologists, has been found to activate the same neural pathways associated with the loss of a real relationship. Readers who have spent extended time with a narrative develop what researchers call parasocial bonds with the world and characters of the text, bonds that are neurologically indistinguishable from those formed with real people and places. When the book ends, those bonds are severed in a specific and recognizable way. The grief is not imaginary or excessive. It is the brain responding accurately to a real loss, the loss of a world it had genuinely inhabited. The loss of a world you had genuinely inhabited. You feel the slight, familiar weight of it already gathering at the edges of the last page. The room around you, real and present and full of mourning, holds steady. The act of closing a book has its own sensory grammar. The soft compression of the pages, the small exhale of air displaced from between them, the click or soft thud of the cover coming to rest. In studies of reading behavior, the physical closing of a book has been found to serve as a stronger memory consolidation signal than simply stopping reading on a screen. The physical gesture, the deliberate bringing together of the two covers, the held pressure of the closed volume, appears to signal to the brain that a unit of experience is complete, triggering the consolidation process by which the contents of working memory are transferred to longer-term storage. Closing a book is not merely the end of reading. It is the beginning of remembering. The beginning of remembering. You close the book. Both hands deliberate, the covers coming together with a sound so soft it barely registers above the birdsong. You set it on the table. It sits there, complete and closed, in the growing light. The library as a concept, a dedicated, organized collection of texts made accessible to readers beyond a single owner, represents one of humanity's oldest and most persistent ideas about what a community owes to its members. The first public library in Rome, established by Gaius Asinius Pollio in approximately 39 BC using the spoils of a military campaign in the Balkans, was explicitly understood by its founder as a gift to the people, knowledge seized in war and returned to the citizens of peace. Pollio placed portrait busts of the authors represented in the collection alongside their works, insisting that the minds that had produced the books be honored alongside the books themselves. The public library began, in other words, as an act of deliberate redistribution, the powerful giving back to the many something that had been taken by force and transformed, through the act of making it available to all, into something that belonged to everyone. Something that belonged to everyone. You look around the room, at the shelves, at the long patient rows of spines, at the morning light moving slowly across the floor, and feel the truth of that inheritance. This room, and every room like it, is a gift made good on, again and again, by everyone who kept the doors open. The dawn light has reached the reading table now. It lies across the closed book in a long, warm stripe, the first direct sunlight the pages will have felt since yesterday. The dust motes move through it slowly, no candle now to drive them upward, only the very slight air currents of the waking room, the morning's first breath moving through the window's old, imperfect seal. Dust motes visible in a shaft of sunlight are significantly larger, on average, than the particles that make up most of the air's invisible particulate matter. The human eye can detect particles down to approximately 50 to 100 microns in diameter under direct light, a fraction of a millimeter. Most atmospheric particles, including the finest paper fibers, skin cells, and fungal spores that constitute the majority of indoor dust, are far smaller than this threshold and remain permanently invisible to the naked eye regardless of illumination. The dust you can see in a beam of light is, in this sense, only the surface of a much larger invisible world, the largest, slowest, most visible fraction of a continuous microscopic storm that never stops, that fills every room and every building on earth, and that you move through without awareness in every moment of your waking life. The surface of a much larger invisible world. The motes turn in the sunlight, patient, ancient, utterly unhurried, and you watch them the way you watched them at the very beginning of this long night, when the afternoon light first named them to you and you first understood that this room was doing something. It has been doing something all along. The oldest words still in active daily use in the English language include day, night, hand, water, fire, and book, all traceable to Proto-Germanic roots more than 4,000 years old. The word read itself derives from the Old English redan, meaning to advise, to interpret, to make sense of, a meaning that precedes the existence of writing and referred originally to the interpretation of signs, omens, and tracts. To read, in its oldest sense, was not to process written symbols but to find meaning in the world itself, to look at something and understand what it was telling you. The literate meaning came later, borrowing the older word's authority. Every time you read a page, you are performing an act whose name is older than the alphabet, older than paper, older than the concept of the book itself. Older than the concept of the book itself. The word read has been in mouths for 4,000 years, meaning, look at this, and understand what it is telling you. You look at the room. You understand what it has been telling you. Libraries, across every culture that has built them, have served as more than repositories of texts. They have served as physical proof that knowledge, once made, need not be lost, that the contents of a single human mind can outlast the body that produced them, can cross oceans and centuries and catastrophes, can arrive in the hands of someone born 1,000 years after the death of the person who first set the words down. The library is humanity's answer to its own mortality, an institution built in the full knowledge that individuals die, and built anyway, because what they knew does not have to die with them. Every book on every shelf is an act of faith in the future, the faith that someone, somewhere, in some year not yet imagined, will want to know this. Will need to know this. Will sit in a quiet room, alone with this, and find in it something that changes how they understand the world. Will sit in a quiet room, alone with this, and find in it something that changes how they understand the world. The morning fills the room completely now. The window holds a sky the color of pale water, not yet blue, not quite gray, that clean and nameless color that belongs only to this hour. The garden outside is fully visible, every branch and stone defined by the growing light. The birds are in full voice. And the room, this particular, beloved, unrepeatable room, is exactly what it was when you arrived. The shelves unchanged. The books unaltered. The dust settling slowly back toward the surfaces from which the night lifted it. The whole room returning, unhurriedly, to the state in which it will wait for the next person who needs it. In 2003, a team of researchers studying the long-term effects of reading on aging populations published findings suggesting that people who read regularly throughout their lives show a significantly slower rate of cognitive decline in old age than non-readers, not merely because reading exercises memory and vocabulary, but because the sustained practice of entering another world, maintaining its internal logic, tracking its characters and arguments, and carrying it forward across multiple reading sessions appears to build what neurologists call cognitive reserve, a resilience in the brain's architecture that provides a buffer against the damage of time. Reading does not simply fill the mind. It builds the structures that allow the mind to continue filling itself. The library nook, return to across a lifetime, the quiet chair, the warm light, the patient shelves, is not an indulgence. It is, for the brain that keeps coming back to it, an act of profound and lasting self-care. An act of profound and lasting self-care. You sit for one more moment in the chair that has held you all night. The book is closed on the table. The candle is out. The morning is here, and the room is full of light, And outside the window the world is resuming its ordinary business with its ordinary noise and its ordinary pace. And none of that feels like a threat to what happened here. Because what happened here is in you now. All 100 of these small lights, the scent of vanillin in old paper, the Brownian dance of the dust motes, the aching fingers of the medieval scribe, the hidden painting on the fan page's edge, the blank last leaf held open like a deliberate silence, all of it folded into the night you spent in this room, which is now part of the night you carry forward. You stand. You push the chair back gently from the table, the way someone does when they mean to return. You may always return. The library will be here. It has always been here. Patient as paper, faithful as thread, full of everything that anyone ever needed to say badly enough to write it down and send it forward into a future they would never see. The dust settles. The light holds. The books breathe. The story is not over. It never is in a room like this. It is only waiting to be read again.